Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the glow of December firelight, where ancient Romans toast their gods with wine, Vikings sing to the returning sun, and early Christians whisper prayers in candlelit catacombs. You're standing at the crossroads of history's most debated question: is Christmas really just a Christian mask over pagan celebrations? Or did the December 25th date emerge from something entirely different? The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why you drag an evergreen tree indoors each year, or why mistletoe hangs above doorways inviting stolen kisses. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or share your favourite December tradition that your family has kept alive for generations. Maybe you light candles on a specific evening, or perhaps you bake cookies shaped like ancient symbols without knowing their original meaning. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the heart of winter, when daylight shrinks to its smallest whisper and darkness claims the world for longer stretches each day. Ancient peoples felt this change in their bones not as a calendar curiosity, but as a cosmic crisis demanding attention, ritual and hope. The winter solstice, falling around December 21st in the northern hemisphere, marked the year's darkest moment when the sun seemed to die a little more each day. Would it return? Would warmth ever grace the frozen earth again? You can imagine the primal fear threading through communities who depended entirely on agriculture, on predictable seasons, on the sun's life-giving power. So they celebrated. Oh, how they celebrated. Romans hosted Saturnalia, a raucous festival honouring Saturn, the god of agriculture and time. Norsemen kindled Yule fires to coax the sun's return and honour Odin's wild rides across winter skies. Persians worshipped Mithras in underground temples, celebrating the birth of the unconquered sun on December 25th. Celts gathered mistletoe, that strange parasitic plant that stays green when everything else dies, and deemed it sacred, magical, a bridge between earth and the divine. Now you're probably wondering, did early Christians simply glance at this crowded December calendar and think, perfect, we'll just slide our Saviour's birthday in here and no one will notice the switch? That's the popular narrative, the one repeated in countless articles and casual conversations. Christmas as pagan festival in disguise, Jesus as the ultimate party crasher at Rome's winter bash. But historians, those meticulous, argumentative scholars who love nothing more than overturning assumptions, have been dueling over this question for centuries. And the answer is far more complicated than a simple yes or no. You see, the Gospels never mention the date of Jesus' birth. Matthew and Luke provide nativity narratives with shepherds, angels, and a star, but neither drops a hint about December or winter or snow-dusted Bethlehem. For Christianity's first few centuries, the birth of Christ wasn't even a major celebration. Early believers focused on Easter, on the resurrection, on the dramatic defeat of death itself. Birthdays were considered pagan customs, something Romans did for emperors and gods. Why would followers of a humble Jewish teacher bother marking the anniversary of his arrival in a Judean stable yet slowly? Curiosity grew. Theologians wanted to know. They wanted completeness, a full accounting of their Messiah's earthly timeline. So they calculated. They used clues from Scripture, symbolic reasoning, and astronomical observations to pinpoint a date. Some early traditions placed Christ's birth in spring, late March or early April. Others argued for January. The December 25th date doesn't appear in written records until the 4th century. Showing up in a Roman almanac from 336 CE, as the official celebration of Christ's Nativity. By then, something fascinating had happened. Christianity had transformed from a persecuted sect into the Roman Empire's favoured religion, thanks to Emperor Constantine's dramatic conversion in 312 CE. Suddenly, the faith needed to accommodate millions of former pagans, people whose December calendars were already crammed with beloved festivals. Did church leaders deliberately schedule Christmas to override these celebrations, to Christianize the pagan masses through strategic date selection? Or did the December 25th choice emerge independently from Christian theological reasoning that had nothing to do with Roman festivals? Historians still argue whether this was clever religious appropriation or remarkable coincidence. You're going to explore both sides tonight, examining the evidence like a detective sorting clues at a crime scene. You'll meet the Roman festivals that dominated December. Discover why evergreen trees became sacred across multiple cultures, and learn how early Christian scholars calculated their Saviour's birthday using methods that might surprise you. You'll watch as Puritans banned Christmas for being too pagan, then see Victorians resurrect it with sentimentality and commerce. You'll trace Santa Claus back through Dutch Sinterklaas, medieval saints, and Norse gods riding eight-legged horses through winter storms. But first, you need to understand the ancient world's December landscape, the festivals, the fears, the desperate human need to mark the darkest days with light, feasting, and hope. Because whether Christmas absorbed pagan traditions or simply grew alongside them, the result is the same: a holiday layered with centuries of human longing, celebration, and the stubborn belief that even in deepest darkness, light will return. The winter solstice wasn't just an astronomical event for ancient peoples, it was the hinge upon which survival swung. You can feel it even now. That subtle melancholy that creeps in when 4:30 brings twilight and mornings start in darkness. Now imagine experiencing that without electric lights, without the certainty that spring will come, without scientific understanding of planetary orbits. You had only patterns, only hope, only the rituals your ancestors swore would bring the sun back from its deathward spiral. So you lit fires, you brought evergreen boughs indoors as proof that life persists. You feasted on stored grain and slaughtered animals because feeding them through winter was costly, and besides, fresh meat wouldn't keep, so why not celebrate abundance before scarcity returned? You gave gifts, reversed social orders, permitted wild behaviour that normal life forbade, for a few precious days. The ordinary rules dissolved and chaos reigned, sanctioned and sacred. This is the world into which Christianity arrived, carrying its own story of light entering darkness, of a child born to save humanity, of hope manifesting in the most humble circumstances imaginable. Whether the December 25th date was chosen to compete with pagan festivals, or emerged from entirely separate reasoning, the symbolism aligned perfectly divine light arriving at the year's darkest moment, warmth promised in the coldest season, a tiny infant challenging empire and death itself. You're ready now to dive deeper, to meet the specific festivals and figures that shape December's sacred landscape. You're going to discover that the Christmas you know, the trees, the gifts, the jolly red-suited figure, the feasting and greenery carries DNA from dozens of traditions, some Christian, some pagan, some purely commercial. And by the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand why the question, is Christmas really pagan, deserves a more nuanced answer than most people expect. You step into Rome during the late December days when Saturnalia transforms the entire city into a carnival of reversed fortunes and sanctioned chaos. The festival typically runs from December the 17th through December the 23rd, though by the late Empire some Romans stretched the celebrations even longer because, frankly, who wants to return to normal life when you're having this much fun? The air smells of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the pine garlands draped across doorways. You hear laughter echoing through marble corridors where normally only serious political discourse and military planning occur. Today, slaves recline on couches while their masters serve them dinner, a topsy-turvy world that exists only during Saturn's sacred week. Saturn himself is an ancient agricultural god, associated with the mythical Golden Age when humanity supposedly lived in peaceful equality without slavery, war, or private property. His temple in the Roman Forum houses the state treasury, and during Saturnalia, the wool bonds that normally bind his statue's feet are loosened, symbolically freeing the god to walk among his people. You watch as Romans of every social class don the pileus, a soft conical felt cap that marks free citizens, because during these days, everyone performs freedom regardless of their actual legal status. It's temporary, theatrical, and deeply cathartic for a society built on rigid hierarchies. The gift-giving starts early. You receive small tokens called sigillaria, little figurines made of clay or wax along with candles that represent the returning light after winter solstice. Wealthier Romans exchange more expensive presents, jewellery, books, fine pottery, or exotic foods. The poet Catullus once complained about receiving terrible gifts during Saturnalia, proving that awkward present exchanges are truly timeless. Children receive toys and dolls. Friends surprise each other with humorous or risque items meant to provoke laughter. The entire practice establishes a template for December gift-giving that will persist, transform, and eventually attach itself to Christian celebrations of Christ's Nativity. But Saturnalia isn't just about presents and role reversal dinners. You participate in public feasting where entire neighbourhoods cook massive communal meals. Gambling, normally restricted or frowned upon, becomes not only permitted but encouraged. Dice games, board games, betting on anything and everything fills the streets. You play games of chance with coins, nuts, and small wagers, joining Romans from every walk of life in this sanctioned rebellion against everyday propriety. The festival also features a Lord of Misrule, a mock king chosen by lot who presides over the festivities and issues absurd commands that everyone must obey. His authority is complete but temporary, dissolving the moment Saturnalia ends. Now here's something historians debate with particular intensity. Did this gift-giving, feasting, and social inversion directly inspire Christmas traditions? Or do they represent universal human responses to winter's darkness that emerged independently across cultures? You're watching Romans exchange presents in late December several centuries before Christians officially celebrated Christ's birth on December 25th. The timing seems too convenient to ignore, yet gift-giving appears in many winter festivals worldwide. It's not uniquely Roman or uniquely Christian. Humans apparently just love exchanging tokens of affection when the world feels coldest and darkest. The Roman writer Seneca, that stern Stoic philosopher, absolutely despised Saturnalia. He complained about the noise, the drinking, the general looseness of morals that infected even respectable citizens. The whole mob has let itself go in pleasures, he grumbled in one letter, clearly the ancient equivalent of someone who hates holiday office parties. But even Seneca admitted that refusing to participate marked you as antisocial, as someone who rejected community bonds, so he endured it, probably while internally composing essays about moderation and virtue. You notice something else during Saturnalia, the evergreen decorations. Romans festoon their homes with laurel, holly, ivy, and other plants that remain green despite winter's assault. These aren't random aesthetic choices. Each plant carries symbolic weight. Laurel belongs to Apollo, god of light and prophecy. Holly's sharp leaves and red berries suggest both defense and life's persistence. Ivy clings to structures and survives where other plants fail, making it a natural symbol for endurance. You're seeing botanical symbolism that will migrate seamlessly into Christian December celebrations, where the same plants will acquire new meanings while retaining their ancient associations with life triumphing over death. The festival also includes public sacrifices at Saturn's temple, where priests in traditional Roman religious garments offer animals to the god while crowds watch and chant. The meat from these sacrifices gets distributed to the people, adding to the general atmosphere of abundance and communal sharing. You're participating in a society-wide celebration that temporarily erases social distinctions, encourages excess, and marks the winter solstice as a turning point worthy of serious attention and joy. But Saturnalia wasn't Rome's only December festival competing for attention. You also witnessed celebrations of the Brumalia, a series of feasts honouring Bacchus and Ceres that extend through December and into January. The Brumalia focuses particularly on wine and grain, the agricultural products that sustained Roman civilization, and features drinking parties that would make modern office holiday celebrations look tame by comparison. Between Saturnalia and Brumalia, elite Romans essentially spent most of December in a pleasant haze of food, wine, games, and social gatherings. Then there's the Kalends of January, the celebration of the New Year on January 1st, which involves even more gift-giving, feasting, and well wishes for the coming year. Romans exchanged striena gifts of figs, dates, honey, and coins while offering prayers to Janus, the two-faced god who looks simultaneously at past and future. The Kalends celebration extends the festival season even further, creating a continuous stretch of December and early January devoted to feasting, gifts, and special observances. You can see why early Christians, trying to establish their own sacred calendar, faced a December already thoroughly packed with beloved celebrations. Some historians argue that when Christianity became Rome's official religion, church leaders deliberately scheduled Christmas to compete with Saturnalia, offering believers a Christian alternative to pagan festivities. The logic seems sound. Why fight against entrenched cultural practices when you can redirect them toward Christian purposes instead of honouring Saturn? Honour Christ. Instead of celebrating the sun's return, celebrate the sun's arrival. Keep the gifts, the feasting, the greenery, the social gathering. Just change the theological justification. It's pragmatic, even brilliant, as conversion strategies go. Other scholars point out that Saturnalia officially ended on December 23rd, while Christmas falls on December 25th, a 2-day gap that matters more than you might think. If church leaders wanted to override Saturnalia specifically, why not place Christmas directly on December 17th or in the middle of the festival? Why choose a date that falls after Saturnalia concludes? This timing suggests that Christmas might not have been aimed at Saturnalia at all, but rather at a different December celebration entirely, one we'll explore soon. You also notice that early Christian writings rarely mention Saturnalia in connection with Christmas dating. The Church Fathers who wrote extensively about calculating Christ's birth, Hippolytus, Julius Africanus, Tertullian, don't reference Saturnalia as a competing concern. They focus instead on scriptural clues, symbolic dates, and theological reasoning. Their silence about Saturnalia could mean they weren't trying to compete with it, or it could mean the competition was so obvious it didn't need stating. Historians still argue about which interpretation fits the evidence better. What's undeniable is that many Saturnalia customs survived Christianization and attached themselves to Christmas celebrations. The gift-giving, the feasting, the decorated homes, the temporary suspension of normal social rules. All of these migrate from Roman paganism into Christian observance. Whether this represents deliberate appropriation, convenient coincidence, or simply humans doing what humans do during dark winter days remains one of history's most fascinating debates. You're watching cultural practices prove more durable than the religions that birthed them, surviving transitions of power and belief through sheer force of communal habit and joy. As you leave Rome's Saturnalia celebrations, your toga replaced by warmer clothing for the journey north, you carry with you the image of a society that knew how to mark winter's turning with exuberance, generosity, and temporary freedom. The Romans understood that darkness demands light, that hierarchy sometimes needs inversion, that midwinter survival requires communal celebration. Whether Christianity borrowed from these practices or simply grew alongside them, the result enriched both traditions in ways that still shape how you celebrate December today. You remain in Rome but shift your attention to a newer cult that's gaining serious momentum in the 3rd century CE, particularly among soldiers, merchants, and the urban working class. You're standing outside a Mithraeum, an underground temple carved from rock or built to resemble a cave where devotees of Mithras gather to worship the Unconquered Sun. The date is December 25th, and you're about to witness the celebration of Sol Invictus, a festival that some historians believe directly competed with early Christmas, while others argue it was Christmas's primary rival for December dominance. Mithras himself is a mysterious figure imported from Persian Zoroastrianism, though the Roman version evolved into something distinctly different from its Eastern origins. In Roman iconography, Mithras appears as a young man in a Phrygian cap, kneeling on a bull and plunging a knife into its neck, the famous tauroctony scene that decorates every Mithraeum. Blood pours from the wound, and from this cosmic sacrifice, life emerges. Wheat springs from the bull's tail, grapes from its blood, a dog, a serpent, and a scorpion attend the scene, each representing celestial or seasonal forces. You're witnessing a religion built on astronomical symbolism, on the movements of stars and planets, on the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The cult is entirely male, organized in 7 ascending grades of initiation, and shrouded in secrecy that makes modern historians want to tear their hair out because the adherents left almost no written explanations of their beliefs. What we know comes from archaeology, the temples, the artwork, the artifacts buried or abandoned when Christianity eventually triumphed. You're experiencing a faith that promised salvation through secret knowledge, moral purity, and loyalty to the community of fellow initiates. It's exclusive, mysterious, and appealing precisely because it offers belonging to something hidden and powerful. December 25th became sacred to Sol Invictus, the Unconquered Sun, during the reign of Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE. Aurelian, facing an empire fragmenting under pressure from Germanic tribes, economic crisis, and competing military factions, needed unifying symbols. He elevated Sol Invictus to supreme status, building a magnificent temple in Rome and establishing December 25th as the sun god's official birthday. The date isn't arbitrary. It falls shortly after the winter solstice, when daylight begins measurably increasing, when the sun literally starts conquering darkness again after its annual retreat. You're watching an emperor use religious innovation as political glue, trying to bind his fracturing empire with shared sacred observance. Now, here's where things get really interesting for the Christmas debate. Some scholars argue that when Christians later chose December 25th for Christ's Nativity, they deliberately picked this date to compete with Sol Invictus, to offer believers a Christian alternative to a popular pagan festival. The symbolism aligns almost too perfectly Christ as the light of the world versus the unconquered sun. The Son of God born on the sun, God's birthday, It's theologically poetic and strategically clever. Early Christian writers even used solar imagery to describe Christ. Malachi's prophecy about the Sun of Righteousness rising with healing in its wings gets quoted extensively. You can see how Christmas's Christian sol Invictus would make intuitive sense, but other historians push back hard against this theory, pointing out significant problems with the timeline and the evidence. First, the earliest reference to December 25th as Christ's birth appears in the chronography of 354, a Roman almanac that lists both Christian and pagan festivals. Christmas appears there as an established celebration, but we don't know exactly when it was first adopted. It could predate Aurelian's Sol Invictus festival by decades. Second, Eastern Christians were calculating December 25th as Christ's birth as early as the late 2nd or early 3rd century, possibly before Sol Invictus became officially associated with that date. The calculations came from an entirely different method that we'll explore soon, based on symbolic dates and Jewish traditions about prophets dying on their conception anniversaries. You watch Mithraic devotees descending into their underground temple, carrying torches that flicker against damp stone walls. The initiation rituals happening in these spaces involve fasting, tests of courage, ritual meals of bread and wine, and oaths of loyalty that bind members to each other and to Mithras. The religion spreads particularly well among Roman legions, who appreciate its emphasis on masculine virtue, hierarchical structure, and promise of cosmic victory over chaos and death. Mithraea appear from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine frontier to North African provinces. For a while, Mithraism looks like Christianity's most serious competitor for the Roman Empire's soul. The similarities between Mithraism and Christianity troubled early church fathers and delight modern conspiracy theorists. Both faiths feature a divine figure associated with salvation. Both use ritual meals involving bread and something to drink. Both promise eternal life to faithful adherents. Both emphasize moral purity and community. The Christian writer Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, accused demons of creating Mithraism as a diabolical parody of Christianity designed to confuse people. Modern scholars roll their eyes at this explanation. Clearly, both religions drew on common Mediterranean and Near Eastern religious concepts, adapting them to their specific theological needs. But did Christians specifically target December 25th to compete with Sol Invictus? The evidence remains genuinely unclear, and historians line up on both sides with compelling arguments. Those who believe in deliberate competition point to the 4th century, when Christianity transitioned from persecuted minority to imperial religion under Constantine. This is exactly when you'd expect strategic calendar decisions, when church leaders would think politically about how to convert the maximum number of pagans with minimal cultural disruption. Keeping beloved festival dates while changing their meaning makes conversion easier. You still get your December celebration, just with new theological content. Skeptics of this theory note that the church fathers who wrote about Christmas dating, particularly Julius Africanus and Hippolytus in the early 3rd century, show no awareness of competing with pagan festivals. They're focused entirely on internal Christian calculations based on scripture and symbolic reasoning. If the December 25th date was chosen specifically to override Sol Invictus, you'd expect at least some contemporary Christian writer to mention this strategy explicitly. The silence suggests maybe the competition wasn't the primary motivation, or perhaps it was so obvious that stating it seemed unnecessary. Historians genuinely can't agree which interpretation fits better. You also notice that Mithraism's December celebration focused on the god's cosmic victory and the sun's returning strength. While Christmas emphasizes Christ's humble birth in poverty, These are dramatically different theological emphases, suggesting the holidays might not have been as directly competitive as the shared date implies. Mithra slays a cosmic bull in a cave. Jesus is born as a human infant in a stable. One celebrates divine power, the other celebrates divine vulnerability. The contrast is stark enough that worshippers of each could theoretically observe their separate festivals on the same day without much confusion about which god they were honouring. There's also the quirky fact that some early Christians actually celebrated Christ's birth on January 6th, a tradition that survives in Eastern Orthodox churches as Epiphany. If December 25th was chosen purely to compete with paganism, why did alternative dates persist in parts of the Christian world? The multiple dates suggest theological calculation and regional variation mattered more than unified strategic competition with specific pagan festivals. You're seeing a messier, more organic process than simple appropriation. Mithraism itself doesn't survive the 4th century's tectonic religious shifts. As Christianity becomes Rome's official faith and pagan temples face closure or conversion, the Mithraea already underground and secret simply empty out and get sealed, abandoned, or deliberately destroyed. The cult's exclusivity and secrecy, once strengths, become fatal weaknesses when faced with Christianity's evangelical universalism. You don't need to be male, a soldier, or capable of passing mysterious initiations to become Christian. You just need baptism and belief. Christianity's accessibility wins the numbers game decisively. But the question lingers, did Christmas absorb Sol Invictus? Or did both celebrations simply occupy the same seasonal moment for independent reasons? You're watching one of a history's great, we'll probably never know for certain debates, where the evidence permits multiple interpretations and scholars defend their preferred theories with genuine passion. Some see deliberate appropriation, others see remarkable coincidence. Still others argue for mutual influence where both religions borrowed from each other and from shared cultural practices. What's undeniable is that by the 5th century, Sol Invictus has vanished from Roman consciousness, while Christmas thrives and expands. The unconquered sun god loses his battle against the Son of God, at least in terms of cultural survival. Whether this happened through direct competition, superior theology, political enforcement, or simple historical contingency depends partly on which historian you ask, and partly on how you interpret fragmentary evidence from a chaotic transitional period when empires and religions rose and fell with dizzying speed. As you leave the Mithraeum, climbing back into winter sunlight that's already strengthening its daily grip on darkness, you carry the image of 2 December 25th celebrations existing simultaneously, one honouring a cosmic bull slayer in underground temples, another honouring a baby in a manger. The symbolism of light conquering darkness links both observances, but whether this represents competition or convergence remains one of the most delicious mysteries in the history of religious festivals. You travel north now, leaving Mediterranean warmth for the frost-hardened lands of Scandinavia and Germanic tribes where winter doesn't just darken, it threatens to consume everything. You're standing in a longhouse somewhere in what will eventually become Norway or Sweden, and outside the wind howls with a ferocity that makes Roman winters seem like mild inconveniences. Inside, a massive log burns in the central hearth, and you are about to discover Yule, the midwinter festival that will contribute some of Christmas's most enduring symbols and traditions. The Yule log itself commands your attention. First, this isn't just firewood. It's a sacred object carefully selected months in advance. You watch as the household patriarch chooses an oak or ash log, preferably from the previous year's Yule log that was partially preserved specifically for this purpose. The log must be enormous, capable of burning for 12 days straight, and its selection involves ritual and prayer. Once lit on the winter solstice, the Yule log must never be allowed to completely extinguish during the festival period. Its ashes will later be scattered on fields to ensure next year's fertility, mixed into animal feed for livestock protection, or kept as charms against lightning and malevolent spirits. Why oak or ash specifically? You're learning that Norse and Germanic peoples considered these trees sacred, associated with Thor and Odin respectively. Oak withstands lightning, Thor's weapon, and was believed to carry the thunder god's protective power. Ash was Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting all 9 realms of Norse cosmology. Burning these woods wasn't just practical heating, it was invoking divine presence and protection during the year's most vulnerable time. The practice will survive Christianization so thoroughly that even Victorian English families in the 1800s will still ceremonially burn Yule logs, often having forgotten the pagan origins but preserving the tradition anyway because, well, it feels right. You notice evergreen boughs decorating every available surface: pine, fir, spruce, holly, ivy, mistletoe, the plants that defy winter's killing touch. To ancient Norse and Germanic peoples, these plants proved that life persists even when everything else appears dead. They brought branches indoors not as mere decoration but as literal life force, as sympathetic magic ensuring that spring would return and the world wouldn't freeze forever. Each plant carried specific meanings. Holly's sharp leaves warded off evil spirits. Ivy symbolized fidelity and eternal life. And mistletoe, that strange plant that grows without touching earth, was so sacred that even enemies meeting beneath it had to declare temporary peace. The mistletoe custom deserves special attention because its origins are genuinely weird and fascinating. You're watching Druids, Celtic priests from regions the Romans called Gaul and Britannia, conduct elaborate rituals around mistletoe harvesting. They cut it with golden sickles on the 6th night after the new moon, catching it in white cloths before it touches the ground, because mistletoe that falls becomes contaminated and loses its power. The plant parasitizes oak trees, growing between earth and sky without roots in either, making it liminal, magical, a bridge between worlds. Druids believed it could cure infertility, protect against poison, and grant access to the underworld. Norse mythology adds another layer to mistletoe's story. It's the plant that killed Baldur the Beautiful, most beloved of the gods. The trickster Loki discovered that Baldur's mother Frigg had extracted promises from every object in creation to never harm her son, except she'd overlooked mistletoe. Deeming it too young and insignificant, Loki fashioned a dart from mistletoe and guided the blind god Hodra's hand to throw it, killing Baldur and triggering a chain of events leading to Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. After Baldur's eventual resurrection, mistletoe became sacred to Frigg, who decreed that it should symbolize love rather than death. Hence, perhaps, the tradition of kissing beneath it, though historians debate whether this romantic association is genuinely ancient or a later invention. The wild hunt rides during these Yule nights, and you'd better be indoors when it passes. You hear the stories whispered around the longhouse fire, Odin leading a thundering cavalcade of dead warriors, hunters and howling hounds across the winter sky. The hunt collects souls, delivers prophecies, and punishes anyone foolish enough to look upon it directly. To appease the hunt, you leave offerings outside grain for Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir, food for the ghostly riders. Some scholars see the wild hunt as a direct ancestor of Santa Claus's flying nocturnal gift delivery, which sounds absurd until you consider the details: a bearded god figure riding the winter sky, checking who's been good worthy of Valhalla, or bad destined for less glorious afterlives, rewarding or punishing accordingly. The parallels are genuinely striking. though the shift from terrifying death collector to jolly gift giver represents quite the character rehabilitation. Feasting during Yule reaches levels that would horrify modern nutritionists but make perfect sense for people facing genuine winter scarcity. You're eating roasted boar, the entire animal, slowly turned over fire for hours until the meat falls off the bone. Pork was sacred to Freya, the fertility god, and consuming it during Yule transferred the god's life-giving power to the community. The boar's head might be paraded around before carving, decorated with bay and rosemary, eventually giving rise to the medieval Boar's Head Carol and the tradition of elaborate Christmas meat centerpieces. You're also drinking mead honey-fermented to alarming potency and ale brewed months earlier specifically for this celebration. The gift-giving happens, though it's less formalized than Roman Saturnalia's exchange. You give and receive practical items, tools, clothing, preserved foods, weapons. But you also exchange ornaments and tokens of affection that serve no utilitarian purpose except strengthening social bonds. The gifts acknowledge interdependence. You survived this year because your neighbours helped, and they'll need your help to survive the next. It's community insurance wrapped in generosity. Pragmatic and heartfelt simultaneously. Humans weren't the only ones honoured during Yule. You watch as people bring extra feed to livestock, sometimes even inviting favourite animals into the house for warmth. Cattle, horses, pigs, and chickens were wealth, survival, and companions. They deserved celebration too. This practice of including animals in winter festivities will migrate into Christian tradition, showing up in stories about animals speaking on Christmas Eve and in nativity scenes where ox and donkey witness Christ's birth. The theological justification changes, but the impulse to honour animals during midwinter persists. Spirits and ancestors also received attention. You see families leaving offerings at burial mounds, inviting the honoured dead to join the feast spiritually, if not physically. Death wasn't a hard boundary. For Norse and Germanic peoples, the dead influenced the living, and the living owed the dead remembrance and respect. This practice of honouring ancestors during midwinter festivals will continue in various forms through Christian celebrations, though often disguised under new names or incorporated into All Saints traditions. The evergreen tree itself, the tradition most people assume is ancient, but that actually has surprisingly recent origins in its current form, doesn't appear yet in your Norse celebration, at least not as a decorated indoor centerpiece. You see evergreen boughs aplenty, and you know that some Germanic tribes considered certain trees sacred dwelling places for spirits, but the specific practice of cutting a fir tree, bringing it indoors, and decorating it won't fully emerge until medieval Germany, and won't become widespread until the Victorian era. This is one of those delightful historical surprises. The ancient pagan Christmas tree is actually younger than many people think, though it builds on older reverence for evergreens. Yule lasted 12 days from winter solstice through the new year, creating a template for the 12 days of Christmas that will appear in Christian tradition. During these days, no wheel could turn avoiding spinning, milling, or wagon driving. No smithing could happen, no battles could be fought. The world rested, turned inward, gathered strength for the coming year. You're experiencing enforced stillness that allowed exhausted agricultural communities to actually rest instead of constantly labouring. It's practical, yes, but also deeply spiritual, acknowledging that humans and nature both need dormancy, silence, and restoration. Some Christians, arriving in these northern lands centuries later, will denounce Yule as demonic paganism requiring total eradication. Others will take a softer approach, arguing that these winter customs can be redirected toward Christian purposes rather than destroyed. The evergreen boughs can symbolize eternal life through Christ. The Yule log can represent the light of God entering darkness. The feasting can celebrate Christ's birth rather than appeasing Norse gods. The gift-giving can honour the Magi's presents to baby Jesus. The 12 days can commemorate the interval between Nativity and Epiphany. Its cultural translation, sometimes cynical, sometimes sincere, but ultimately pragmatic converts are more likely to stay converted if they can keep some beloved traditions, even with modified meanings. You notice something important: these Yule traditions aren't consciously competing with Christmas, because Christianity hasn't arrived yet in these regions. The Norse and Germanic peoples are celebrating winter solstice for their own reasons, according to their own beliefs, without any awareness of Palestinian carpenters or Roman emperors. When Christianity eventually reaches Scandinavia through a complex mixture of trade, military conquest, missionary effort, and political calculation, these Yule traditions are already ancient, already woven into cultural identity. The question becomes not, can Christianity override these traditions, but rather, how will Christianity and Yule coexist, blend or conflict as you prepare to leave the Longhouse? Stepping into crystalline cold where stars blaze with shocking clarity and the aurora borealis shimmers green across the northern sky, you understand that Yule represented something profound: humanity's refusal to surrender to darkness. Light would return because people insisted on it, celebrated it, and kept fires burning until the sun remembered its duty. Whether you call it Yule or Christmas or the winter solstice, the impulse remains the same: to mark the turning point with light, warmth, community, and stubborn hope that spring exists somewhere beyond the frozen present. You leave the frost-covered north and return to the Mediterranean world. But this time you're not observing pagans. You're sitting in dusty scriptoriums and modest Christian meeting houses during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, watching early theologians wrestle with a question that's becoming increasingly important to their communities. When exactly was Jesus born? You're about to discover that the December 25th date might not have been borrowed from pagans at all, but rather calculated independently through distinctly Christian reasoning that's both mathematically precise and symbolically beautiful. The method starts with a belief that great prophets and righteous men died on the same calendar date they were conceived. You're encountering an idea that seems bizarre to modern minds, but made perfect sense to ancient theologians steeped in symbolic thinking and divine patterns. God, they reasoned, wouldn't allow his anointed ones to live messy, uneven lifespans. There had to be numerical perfection, cosmic symmetry. If you could determine when Jesus died, you could calculate when he was conceived, and from conception to birth is roughly 9 months. Simple arithmetic that yields profound theological satisfaction. Jesus' crucifixion date is known with reasonable certainty. It occurred during Passover under Pontius Pilate's governorship, which historical and astronomical calculations place around 33 CE. The exact day varies depending on which gospel account you prioritize and how you reconcile Jewish and Roman calendars. But many early Christian scholars settled on March 25th in the Roman calendar, or Nisan 14 in the Jewish calendar. This becomes your starting point. Jesus died on March 25th. Therefore he was conceived on March 25th. Therefore he was born 9 months later on December 25th. The calculation is elegant, self-contained, and requires no reference whatsoever to pagan festivals. You're reading the work of Sextus Julius Africanus, a Christian chronographer writing around 221 CE, who mentions December 25th as Christ's birth date based on exactly this type of calculation. His work predates Emperor Aurelian's establishment of Sol Invictus on December 25th by more than 50 years. which seriously complicates the theory that Christians borrowed the date from pagans. If Christians were already celebrating, or at least calculating, December 25th as Christ's birth before Sol Invictus claimed that date officially, then who borrowed from whom, or did both traditions arrive at the same date independently for completely different reasons? The Eastern Christian tradition offers a parallel calculation that's equally fascinating. Eastern theologians often placed Jesus' crucifixion and conception on April 6th rather than March 25th, using similar symbolic reasoning but different calendar systems. 9 months from April 6th brings you to January 6th, which is exactly when many Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate Christ's Nativity to this day. You're seeing two separate traditions using identical methodology but different starting assumptions, arriving at different dates that both communities defended as theologically and historically correct. Neither December 25th nor January 6th were chosen to compete with pagan festivals. They emerged from internal Christian scriptural interpretation. But the reasoning goes even deeper than simple arithmetic. You're discovering that early Christians were absolutely obsessed with symbolic dates and divine patterns in history. They believed God orchestrated events according to numerological perfection that revealed deeper truths about salvation. March 25th wasn't randomly chosen as Jesus' crucifixion date, it also corresponded roughly to the spring equinox, which had rich symbolic resonance. The spring equinox marked creation itself in some Jewish traditions. God created the world in spring when life awakens. Having Jesus die and be conceived on the same date when creation began established him as the new creation, the restoration of what was lost in Eden. This symbolic layering becomes almost dizzying. You're learning that March 25th was also associated in some Christian traditions with Adam's creation and with Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. Theologians loved these convergences. They proved divine intentionality, showed that God orchestrated history according to patterns that careful study could reveal. December 25th as Christ's birth wasn't a random choice or a cynical appropriation of paganism. It was the inevitable result of a complex theological calculation that tried to fit Jesus' life into a cosmos of meaningful dates and divine symmetry. Here's where skeptics raise objections, and they're not wrong to be suspicious. The idea that Jesus was conceived on the exact date he died requires believing in either an extraordinary coincidence or divine orchestration of biology, neither of which holds up to modern historical analysis. The Gospel writers don't mention any such pattern, and imposing it retroactively feels like theologians creating evidence for predetermined conclusions. You're watching sacred mathematics that prioritizes symbolic truth over historical accuracy, which was perfectly normal for ancient thinking but makes modern historians squirm. There's also the inconvenient fact that shepherds watching their flocks by night, as described in Luke's Nativity, probably wouldn't have been in fields during December in Judea, where temperatures drop uncomfortably and livestock typically stay sheltered. This detail has led some scholars to propose spring or fall as more likely historical birth seasons. If we care about historical accuracy rather than theological symbolism, but early Christians weren't primarily concerned with historical accuracy in the modern sense. They were building theological frameworks that explained divine purpose, and for that mission, symbolic dates mattered more than meteorological plausibility. You also need to consider that the early church didn't uniformly adopt December 25th immediately. You're watching a gradual process where different Christian communities calculated or selected different dates, debated their reasoning, and eventually most but not all Western Christians converged on December the 25th, while Eastern Christians often maintained January 6th. This diversity suggests that no single authority imposed the date for strategic anti-pagan reasons. Instead, various theologians were independently calculating, and the December 25th calculation happened to win out in the West, possibly because it aligned with existing Roman festival dates, or possibly just because influential church fathers promoted it effectively. The theologian Hippolytus, writing around 204 CE, also references December 25th as Christ's birth in his commentary on Daniel. Again, predating Sol Invictus's official designation, you're accumulating evidence that December 25th had Christian significance independent of pagan competition, which doesn't necessarily mean paganism played no role, but does complicate the simple narrative of Christian appropriation. Maybe the truth involves multiple factors. Christians calculated December the 25th for their own theological reasons, and this date happened to fall near or on existing pagan celebrations, creating a happy accident that aided conversion efforts later when Christianity sought mass acceptance. There's also the issue of John the Baptist's conception, which plays a role in some of these calculations. Luke's Gospel mentions that John's father Zacharias was serving in the temple during a specific priestly course when he learned of his wife's pregnancy. Some theologians attempted to calculate when this occurred, then counted forward to John's birth, then added 6 months since Luke says Mary visited pregnant Elizabeth when Mary was newly pregnant, arriving at Jesus' birth. Different scholars counting differently got different results, but some arrived at December or early January. You're seeing earnest attempts to extract historical timelines from scriptural hints, using the tools and assumptions available to ancient minds. The symbolic significance of December itself carried weight beyond just matching pagan dates. December marked the beginning of lengthening days after the winter solstice light literally conquering darkness in the natural world. For Christians developing metaphorical language about Christ as the light of the world and the Sun of righteousness, having his birth coincide with the sun's returning strength was symbolically perfect, even beautiful. This symbolism worked whether or not pagans were also celebrating solar deities on nearby dates. The natural phenomenon of increasing daylight provided symbolic resonance that any religion could tap into. You notice something important in Christian apologetic writings from the 4th and 5th centuries when Christmas was becoming standardized and Christianity was competing openly with paganism. These writers don't say we cleverly scheduled Christmas to override pagan festivals. Instead, they argue that pagan festivals were demonic counterfeits of Christian truth, that demons knew Christ would be born on December 25th and created Sol Invictus celebrations to confuse people. It's bizarre reasoning to modern ears, but it suggests these Christians genuinely believed their December 25th date had independent, sacred origins, rather than being strategically appropriated from paganism. Of course, absence of explicit strategic discussion doesn't prove strategy didn't exist. Church leaders might have been savvy enough not to openly advertise their appropriation tactics. But you're left with competing possibilities. Either Christians independently calculated December 25th through theological reasoning, and the pagan festival overlap was genuinely coincidental, or church leaders strategically chose December 25th to compete with paganism and simply didn't write down their political calculations, or some messy combination of both factors influenced different Christian communities differently at different times. Historians genuinely can't reach consensus on which scenario fits the evidence best. What becomes clear is that the question, is Christmas rooted in pagan festivals, depends heavily on whether you're asking about the date or the customs. The date itself might have emerged independently from Christian theological calculation, making it genuinely Christian in origin even if it coincidentally aligned with pagan celebrations. But the customs, the feasting, gift-giving, greenery, social celebration, those clearly have pre-Christian origins that were absorbed, adapted, or paralleled in Christian observance. You're seeing how a holiday can be simultaneously Christian and pagan, depending on which elements you're examining. As you leave the scriptoriums where monks are carefully copying chronologies and theological treatises, you carry a new appreciation for how seriously early Christians took these calculations. They weren't cynically appropriating paganism. They were earnestly trying to locate their Saviour's birth within a cosmos of meaningful patterns and divine orchestration. Whether their math was correct historically matters less than recognizing their theological sincerity. The December 25th date might be both authentically Christian in origin and suspiciously convenient for converting pagans. History loves these kinds of productive ambiguities. You stand in the year 312 CE, watching one of history's most consequential moments unfold at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome. Constantine, a Roman general competing for imperial control, sees a vision or claims he does of a cross in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He orders his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, defeats his rival Maxentius decisively, and begins Christianity's transformation from persecuted minority faith to imperial religion. You're about to witness how Constantine's conversion, whether genuine spiritual awakening or brilliant political calculation, created the conditions for Christmas to absorb, override, or coexist with pagan December festivals on an unprecedented scale. Constantine didn't immediately ban paganism that would have triggered civil war in an empire where the vast majority still worship traditional gods. Instead, he pursued a policy of gradual Christianization mixed with strategic tolerance. A delicate balancing act that required making Christianity appealing to pagans while not alienating his Christian supporters by seeming too pagan-friendly. You're watching religious politics at its most pragmatic, where theological truth takes a back seat to imperial stability and where calendar decisions carry enormous political weight. The challenge facing Constantine and subsequent Christian emperors was straightforward. How do you convert millions of people whose entire cultural calendar revolves around pagan festivals without provoking massive resistance? You can't simply erase Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, the Kalends of January, and expect Romans to accept the void cheerfully. People love their festivals, the feasting, the gifts, the social bonding, the break from ordinary labour. Take those away and you create resentment, possibly rebellion, but allow them to continue unchanged and you undermine Christianity's exclusive claims. The solution, elegant and perhaps inevitable, was to Christianize existing festivals rather than eliminate them. You watch as church councils and bishops throughout the 4th century grapple with this problem explicitly. Should Christians celebrate Christ's birth at all? Given that birthday celebrations are pagan customs, the answer gradually shifts toward yes. But with careful theological framing, this isn't just any birthday, it's the incarnation of God. The moment divinity entered humanity, an event worthy of commemoration. Should they place this celebration in December near pagan festivals? The question generates less written debate than you'd expect. Possibly because the December 25th date was already circulating from earlier theological calculations, or possibly because the strategic benefit seemed too obvious to require extensive discussion. Constantine himself promoted solar imagery that could appeal to both Christians and Sol Invictus worshippers. Coins from his reign show sun symbols, and he continued supporting solar festivals even while favouring Christianity. You're seeing deliberate ambiguity, creating space where pagans could interpret his religious symbols as honouring their gods while Christians could read the same symbols as metaphors for Christ. This theological flexibility, maddening to purists on both sides, allowed gradual conversion without violent rupture. The sun god and the Son of God could briefly coexist in visual propaganda, before eventually the latter displaced the former. The Christianization strategy extended beyond just selecting dates. It involved transforming the meaning and customs of existing festivals. You watch as church leaders encourage Christians to keep the feasting, gift-giving, and social celebration of Saturnalia, but redirect these practices toward Christian purposes. Give gifts to remember the Magi's presence to Christ. Feast to celebrate God's generosity in sending His Son. Decorate with evergreens to symbolize eternal life through Christ rather than pagan vitality magic. The familiar customs persist, but their theological justification gets rewritten. It's cultural continuity with religious disruption or vice versa, depending on your perspective. Some bishops took harder lines, denouncing any accommodation with pagan customs as dangerous compromise. You read sermons from church fathers like John Chrysostom, who railed against Christians participating in pagan festivals, warning that drinking, dancing, and general revelry honour demons rather than Christ. These voices lost the debate, probably because they were asking for cultural changes too radical for most converts to accept. Christianity won the Roman Empire partly by being flexible about cultural practices. While insisting on theological orthodoxy, you could keep your December parties as long as you acknowledge Christ as Lord. The process wasn't instantaneous or uniform. You're watching a centuries-long transition where Christianity and paganism blended, competed, and gradually separated across different regions at different speeds. In some areas, pagan festivals continued openly into the 5th and 6th centuries despite official Christian dominance. In others, Christianization happened more rapidly, especially in urban centres where imperial authority and church presence were strongest. Rural areas pagan literally means country dweller, maintained older practices longest, sometimes blending them with Christian elements in ways that horrified church authorities but satisfied local communities. Constantine's most lasting contribution might have been establishing the precedent that Christianity should shape civic life and public calendars. Before Constantine, Christians celebrated their faith in private homes and underground. After Constantine, Christian festivals became official state occasions with public funding, architectural monuments, and legal protections. Christmas couldn't have become the dominant December festival without this imperial support. You're seeing how political power transforms religious practice. Constantine didn't just convert himself, he converted the empire's entire institutional framework. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, called by Constantine to resolve theological disputes, didn't explicitly address Christmas dating, but it established the principle that church councils could set universal Christian practices. Later councils would build on this precedent, gradually standardizing when and how Christians should celebrate various holy days. You're watching institutional Christianity develop the bureaucratic mechanisms necessary to establish uniform observance across vast geographical and cultural distances. Without this institutional development, December 25th might have remained one option among many rather than becoming the definitive Western Christian date. You notice that Constantine's mother Helena also plays a fascinating role in Christianizing the landscape. She travelled to Palestine identifying sites associated with Jesus' life, founding churches at Bethlehem's supposed nativity location and Jerusalem's crucifixion site. These pilgrimage destinations gave Christians physical spaces to connect with their faith's origins, making Christianity feel rooted in specific geography rather than floating abstractly. When people could visit the alleged birthplace, Christ's birth became more historically real, more worthy of annual commemoration. Helena's church building inadvertently boosted Christmas's importance by making the Nativity tangible. The question of Constantine's sincerity haunts historians. Was his conversion genuine or purely political calculation? You examine the evidence both ways. On one hand, he continued some pagan practices, maintained the title Pontifex Maximus Chief Pagan Priest, and only got baptized on his deathbed. On the other, he funded church construction extensively, involved himself in theological disputes, and granted Christians legal privileges. Probably he was both sincere and calculating, believing Christianity was true while also recognizing its political utility. Humans contain multitudes, and 4th century emperors were no exception. What matters for Christmas history isn't Constantine's personal piety, but the structural changes he initiated. By making Christianity socially advantageous and eventually legally favoured, he created conditions where converting to Christianity meant joining the winning team. And winning teams get to reshape cultural calendars. You're watching Christianity leverage political power to achieve what theological argument alone might never have accomplished: the mass conversion of an empire and the transformation of its festival calendar. The subsequent emperors, Theodosius particularly, took harder lines than Constantine, eventually banning pagan worship outright and closing temples. By the late 4th century, Christianity was no longer just favoured but mandatory, at least officially. This coercive phase differs significantly from Constantine's more flexible approach, and historians debate which strategy was more effective at actually converting hearts rather than just compelling outward conformity. You're seeing how Christianity's relationship with state power evolved from persecution to toleration, to establishment to enforcement across 3 centuries. The fusion of Christian theology with imperial authority created what historians call Christendom, a civilization where Christianity shapes every aspect of public and private life, where church and state reinforce each other, where being a citizen means being Christian. This fusion made Christmas's dominance inevitable. Once Christianity controlled civic calendars, pagan festivals like Saturnalia and Invictus could be suppressed, absorbed, or reinterpreted. The December 25th celebration shifted from being one option among many to being the official, legally protected, imperially funded observance that gradually overshadowed alternatives. But you also notice resistance, both overt and subtle. Some pagans continued their traditional December celebrations privately, keeping the customs but hiding the theological content. Some Christians remained uncomfortable with the pagan-flavoured revelry that accompanied Christmas celebrations, preferring more sober observances focused on prayer rather than parties. The tension between Christmas as solemn religious holy day and Christmas as raucous social festival begins here in the 4th and 5th centuries, and it will never fully resolve. Even modern celebrations contain this dual character, sacred and secular intertwined. Constantine's legacy for Christmas is ultimately this. He created the political conditions where Christianity could reshape December's cultural meaning without eliminating December's beloved customs. Whether you call this strategic brilliance or cynical appropriation depends partly on your religious commitments and partly on how you interpret Constantine's motivations. But the result was undeniable by the 6th century. Christmas had become the dominant December festival across the former Roman Empire, absorbing some pagan elements, suppressing others, and creating something that was simultaneously continuation and transformation of older winter celebrations. As you leave Constantine's era, moving forward into the medieval period where Christmas will continue evolving, you carry the understanding that religious change rarely happens through pure theological argument. It happens through political power, strategic compromise, institutional development, and the gradual processes by which communities adapt to new authorities while preserving beloved traditions. Constantine didn't invent Christmas, but he created the world where Christmas could triumph over its pagan competitors and establish itself as the defining December celebration for Western civilization. You find yourself in 15th century Germany, standing in a forest where fir trees stretch toward grey winter skies, their evergreen needles defying the season's deathly grip. You're about to trace one of Christmas's most recognizable symbols, the decorated tree, and discover that its origins are far more recent and less straightforwardly pagan than most people assume. The Christmas tree, that icon of ancient tradition, is actually a medieval innovation that only became widespread in the 19th century, though it builds on older reverence for evergreens that stretches back to the very practices you've already explored. The earliest reliable references to decorated Christmas trees appear in German guild records from the 1400s. You read accounts of craftsmen's guilds in cities like Freiburg and Basel setting up trees decorated with apples, nuts, dates, and paper flowers in their guild halls. These weren't domestic traditions, yet they were semi-public displays by professional organizations. Part of the medieval corporate culture where guilds competed for prestige and demonstrated their wealth through elaborate celebrations. The trees served as centerpieces for guild parties, and after the festivities, young apprentices were often allowed to shake them and claim the treats that fell. But why trees specifically? You're learning that medieval Christians associated the fir tree with the Garden of Eden, particularly with the paradise tree used in mystery plays performed on December the 24th, the feast day of Adam and Eve in the medieval calendar. These plays dramatized humanity's fall and the promise of redemption, and the paradise tree, decorated with apples representing forbidden fruit and sometimes communion wafers representing salvation, became a visual theology lesson. When mystery plays were eventually banned or fell out of fashion, some families apparently brought the paradise tree tradition into their homes, gradually transforming it from religious drama prop to domestic decoration. The legend of Martin Luther inventing the Christmas tree makes for a charming story, but probably isn't historically accurate. According to the tale, Luther was walking through a forest one winter night, saw starlight twinkling through evergreen branches, and was so moved by the beauty that he brought a tree home and decorated it with candles to recreate the effect for his children. It's poetic, emotionally satisfying, and almost certainly apocryphal. No contemporary accounts from Luther's lifetime mention him doing this, and the story only appears in written form centuries later. You're encountering one of history's delightful fictions, a narrative that feels true enough that it persists despite lacking evidence. What is documented is that Protestant Germans in the 16th and 17th centuries increasingly adopted tree decorating as a Christmas custom, possibly as a counterpoint to Catholic nativity scenes. You're watching religious competition drive cultural innovation. Protestants wanted distinctively Protestant Christmas traditions that didn't involve Catholic imagery like saints and the Virgin Mary. The Christmas tree, with its biblical associations to Eden and its emphasis on family celebration rather than clerical authority, fit Protestant sensibilities perfectly. It was domestic, scripture-adjacent, and visually impressive without requiring priestly mediation. The decorations evolved delightfully. You see trees adorned with gilded nuts, paper roses, glass balls, initially expensive luxuries, cookies shaped like stars and hearts, strings of cranberries, popcorn garlands, and small toys. Candles clipped to branches created magical flickering light, though also terrifying fire hazards. Many a Victorian memoir mentions Christmas trees bursting into flame and the frantic bucket brigades needed to prevent house fires. The tree became a showcase for both natural abundance and human craftsmanship, a collaboration between forest and family that turned an ordinary fir into something enchanted. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German-born consort, famously popularised the Christmas tree in England during the 1840s. You see the Illustrated London News publishing an engraving in 1848 showing the royal family gathered around a decorated tree at Windsor Castle. And suddenly, every aspirational middle-class British family wants one too. The image was so influential that when it was republished in American magazines, Albert's distinctive German appearance was edited out to make the scene look more universally relatable. You're watching how royal endorsement and mass media combined to spread a regional German custom across the English-speaking world within a single generation. The tree reached America through multiple routes. German immigrants brought the tradition to Pennsylvania in the 18th century, where it remained largely confined to German communities for decades. Hessian soldiers serving in the Revolutionary War set up Christmas trees, puzzling their American captors who found the custom charmingly foreign. But widespread American adoption didn't happen until the Victorian era, when the same royal example that influenced Britain also shaped American middle-class aspirations. By the 1870s and 1880s, American magazines were publishing articles about Christmas tree decoration. Stores were selling ornaments, and the practice had become thoroughly naturalized as an American tradition. Now here's where the pagan connection gets complicated. Many people assume the Christmas tree directly continues ancient pagan tree worship. Didn't Germans and Norse peoples revere sacred groves and specific trees as divine dwelling places? They absolutely did. But the specific practice of cutting a tree, bringing it indoors, and decorating it doesn't appear in ancient sources. You're not finding Druids or Vikings doing this. What you do find is reverence for living trees in their natural locations, offerings left at their roots, rituals performed in their shade. That's different from the Christmas tree custom, even if there's a conceptual through line about trees embodying life force. The evergreen aspect matters enormously. That's where genuine pagan continuity exists. The ancient practice of bringing evergreen boughs indoors during winter predates Christianity by centuries, as you've already seen with Roman Saturnalia decorations and Norse Yule greenery. The Christmas tree is essentially an elaboration of this older custom, concentrating the evergreen symbolism into a single impressive centerpiece rather than scattering branches around the house. So the tree is both innovation and continuation, new in its specific form but ancient in its underlying logic about evergreens representing enduring life. Christian theologians developed elaborate symbolic interpretations to Christianize the tree. The evergreen nature represented Christ's eternal life and the promise of resurrection. The triangular shape suggested the Holy Trinity. The star or angel placed on top commemorated the Nativity star, or the angels who announced Christ's birth. The lights represented Christ as the light of the world. The presents beneath recalled the Magi's gifts. Every element received theological justification, transforming what might have been a pagan holdover into explicitly Christian iconography. Whether these interpretations were sincere theology or strategic Christianization of a beloved customs, you can't definitively say, probably both, varying by individual and era. The Christmas tree industry became genuinely significant by the late 19th century. You watch as enterprising farmers start deliberately cultivating firs and pines for the Christmas market, transforming what had been forest harvesting into commercial agriculture. Cities established Christmas tree markets where families could select their perfect specimen. The economics of Christmas tree farming planting saplings that won't be harvestable for 7 to 10 years required long-term planning and investment, that gradually created an entire seasonal industry. You're seeing capitalism embrace and amplify a cultural tradition, making it more accessible while also commercializing what had been a more intimate, family-centered practice. Artificial trees appeared surprisingly early. The Germans invented the feather tree in the 19th century, using goose feathers dyed green to create fire-safe alternatives to real evergreens. These look nothing like real trees, more like green bottle brushes, but they served their purpose and allowed families without access to forests or markets to participate in the tradition. Modern plastic trees emerged in the 20th century, sparking ongoing debates about authenticity, environmental impact, and whether artificial trees violate the Christmas spirit or simply represent pragmatic adaptation to changed circumstances. The environmental concerns around Christmas trees, cutting millions of trees annually for weeks of display before disposal, trouble modern ecologists. Though tree farmers reasonably point out that Christmas tree farms are renewable agriculture, that farmed trees get replaced, and that they provide habitat and carbon sequestration while growing. The debate reflects broader tensions about whether Christmas traditions should adapt to contemporary concerns or be preserved regardless of environmental cost. You're watching a living tradition continuing to evolve as new values and challenges emerge. Rockefeller Center's massive Christmas tree, first erected in 1931 by construction workers during the Depression, became an American cultural icon, broadcast on television and attracting millions of visitors annually. You see how a single spectacular example can shape national consciousness about what Christmas should look like. The Rockefeller tree established expectations, massive height, thousands of lights, public spectacle that influenced both civic displays and private ambitions. Communities across America now compete for the biggest, most impressive public Christmas tree, turning the tradition into a statement about civic pride and seasonal cheer. The Christmas tree's journey from medieval German guilds to global ubiquity represents a remarkable case of cultural diffusion, a regional custom amplified by religious meaning, royal endorsement, mass media, and commercial interests became so thoroughly naturalized across multiple cultures that people now assume it's ancient and universal. You're seeing how traditions that feel eternal and essential are often quite recent, how the 19th century particularly excelled at inventing traditions while claiming to preserve ancient practices, and how something can be simultaneously new and genuinely rooted in older symbolic systems. As you step back from the forest where modern families now select their annual trees arguing about height, fullness, and straightness, you understand that the Christmas tree embodies the holiday's essential character, part Christian, part pagan, part commercial, part domestic, simultaneously sacred and secular, ancient in resonance but surprisingly modern in specific practice. Whether it represents pagan continuity or Christian innovation depends on which aspects you emphasize. And the answer is probably both, because history rarely offers simple either-or choices when dealing with beloved cultural practices that persist across centuries and civilizations. You're gathering armfuls of holly, ivy, and mistletoe in the English countryside during a grey December afternoon, preparing to decorate your home according to traditions so old that their origins blur into folklore and half-remembered pagan practices. These plants sharp-leaved, berry bright, mysteriously evergreen carry meanings that have evolved across centuries, acquiring Christian interpretations while never quite shedding their pre-Christian associations. You're about to decode the greenery that transforms ordinary houses into Christmas spaces, discovering how botanical symbolism bridges pagan and Christian worlds more seamlessly than almost any other holiday element, Holly commands your attention first with its aggressive beauty, those glossy dark leaves armed with spines that draw blood if you're careless. Those brilliant red berries that birds devour, but humans find mildly toxic. In pre-Christian Britain and across Celtic regions, holly was considered protective, capable of warding off evil spirits, lightning strikes, and malevolent witchcraft. You're learning that people planted holly near their homes deliberately, creating living shields against supernatural threats. The plant's ability to stay green and even produce fruit during winter made it seem magically vital, proof that life could persist despite cold and darkness. Romans associated holly with Saturn and used it extensively during Saturnalia, the very festival you explored earlier. They gave holly wreaths as gifts, decorated their homes with branches, and believed the plant brought good fortune. Some Romans wore holly crowns during Saturnalia celebrations, a practice that looks distinctly like the crown of thorns when you view it through Christian typological thinking. You're watching how a single plant can accumulate layers of meaning across different cultures, each adding interpretation without necessarily erasing earlier associations. Christian symbolism embraced holly enthusiastically, seeing in its sharp leaves the crown of thorns that pierced Christ's head during crucifixion, and in its red berries the drops of sacred blood. Some medieval legends claimed holly berries were originally white and turned red only after being stained by Christ's blood, a poetic origin story that gave the plant explicit Christian credentials. The evergreen nature represented eternal life through Christ, while the plant's defensive spines symbolized protection against sin and evil. You're seeing how Christian interpreters could take a pagan protective plant and reframe its protection as specifically Christian, offering defense against spiritual rather than merely supernatural threats. But holly also acquired gender associations that feel distinctly pre-Christian. Medieval carols and folklore often contrasted holly masculine with ivy feminine, sometimes depicting them as married couple, sometimes as competitors. The Holly and the Ivy carol, still sung today, references this gendered symbolism. The holly bears a blossom as white as lily flower, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ to be our sweet Saviour. You're encountering folk Christianity that's not quite orthodox theology, where plants embody social relationships and theological truths get expressed through botanical metaphor. Ivy presents its own complex symbolism, this climbing vine that strangles trees or embraces buildings, depending on your perspective, represented fidelity and eternal life because it clings tenaciously and stays green year-round. Ancient Greeks associated ivy with Dionysus, the wine god, and wore ivy wreaths during drinking parties, believing the plant prevented intoxication. Romans continued this association, making ivy crowns popular at banquets. The plant's reputation for both fidelity and drunkenness creates an odd symbolic tension. Is ivy constant devotion or enabling addiction? Perhaps both, depending on context. Christian interpretation emphasized ivy's clinging nature as representing the soul's dependence on God, or the Church's relationship to Christ. Just as ivy needs a support structure to climb, humans need divine support for salvation. The evergreen aspect again signified eternal life, and ivy's ability to thrive in shade made it a symbol for patience and endurance through difficulty. Medieval churches grew ivy on their walls deliberately, the living plant becoming part of sacred architecture, blurring boundaries between natural and built, between God's creation and human construction. The gendering of ivy as feminine sometimes positioned it as subordinate to masculine holly, reflecting medieval patriarchal assumptions. But ivy also had fierce defenders who noted that while holly might be showy with its berries and spines, ivy was actually tougher, capable of pulling down entire buildings, surviving where nothing else could. The battle between holly and ivy in folk songs and games sometimes ended with ivy's victory, suggesting not everyone accepted simple male superiority narratives. You're finding proto-feminist botanical allegory hiding in Christmas greenery traditions. Mistletoe presents the most fascinating case, simultaneously the most pagan and the most mysterious of Christmas plants. You've already encountered mistletoe in Druid rituals and Norse mythology, but its Christmas associations deserve deeper examination. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that grows on tree branches, particularly favouring apple and oak trees, sending roots into the host wood and stealing nutrients. It never touches the ground, existing in a liminal space between earth and sky, which ancient peoples found deeply significant, neither fully of the earth nor of the heavens. Mistletoe occupied its own magical category. The Druids' elaborate mistletoe harvesting rituals reflected this special status. The golden sickle, the white cloth, the prohibition against letting harvested mistletoe touch ground, these weren't arbitrary rules, but attempts to preserve the plant's liminal power by preventing it from being contaminated by earthly contact. Mistletoe harvested properly could allegedly cure infertility, protect against poison, grant access to the underworld, and reveal hidden things. It was medicine, magic, and sacred mystery combined in one unassuming plant with white berries and pale green leaves. The Norse myth of Balder dying from mistletoe gives the plant darker associations. It's the overlooked danger, the seemingly innocent thing that proves fatal, the weapon nobody suspects. But the story's continuation, where Balder's mother Frigg transforms mistletoe into the symbol of love after his resurrection, creates redemptive mythology around the plant. This transformation from death dealer to love symbol might be ancient, or it might be medieval Christianization of older myths. Scholars debate the story's origins and whether the kissing tradition genuinely descends from Frigg's decree or represents later invention falsely attributed to pagan practice. The kissing under mistletoe custom appears clearly documented only from the 18th century in England, which is suspiciously recent for a supposedly ancient pagan tradition. You're discovering that the custom might have been invented or significantly elaborated during the Georgian and Victorian periods, when romanticizing pagan customs became fashionable. The rules were specific and delightfully elaborate. A man could kiss any woman standing under mistletoe, but he had to pluck a berry with each kiss, and once all berries were gone, the kissing power expired. The woman couldn't refuse without risking bad luck, a rule that modern sensibilities rightly find problematic, but that Victorians apparently considered charming romantic fate. Christian authorities had conflicted relationships with mistletoe, because it never appears in the Bible and has such strong pagan associations. Many churches banned mistletoe from Christmas decorations entirely, even while welcoming holly and ivy. You'll notice that traditional Christmas carols mention holly and ivy constantly, but rarely reference mistletoe. It was too pagan, too sexual, too connected to pre-Christian practices to be easily Christianized. The plant remained in popular custom, but was largely excluded from official Christian observance, creating a division between church Christmas and home Christmas that persists in subtle ways. Some medieval legends tried to Christianize mistletoe by claiming it had once been a tree from which the cross was made, and God cursed it to become a parasitic plant as punishment. This origin story attempted to explain mistletoe's strange growth habit while giving it biblical connection, but the legend never gained widespread acceptance. Mistletoe stubbornly remained pagan in most people's consciousness, which is probably part of its enduring appeal. It represents the Christmas element that Christianity never fully conquered, the persistent remainder of pre-Christian practice. Box, rosemary, bay laurel, and pine joined holly, ivy, and mistletoe in the Christmas greenery ensemble, each bringing its own symbolic associations. Bay laurel connected to victory and Apollo. Rosemary meant remembrance and was associated with the Virgin Mary. In some traditions, rosemary, supposedly derived from Rose of Mary, though this etymology is questionable. Pine and fir represented the same evergreen vitality as holly and ivy, but in tree form rather than shrub or vine. The overall effect of homes decorated with multiple evergreen species was to bring the forest indoors, to surround yourself with living green during the season when nearly everything else appeared dead. The custom of making evergreen wreaths deserves attention. These circular arrangements symbolized eternity because circles have no beginning or end. Ancient Romans made wreaths for various celebrations. Christians adopted the practice, and Advent wreaths with their 4 candles became distinctly Christian objects with theological meaning attached to each element. But the basic wreath form transcends religious boundaries, appearing in pagan, Christian, and secular contexts as a near-universal symbol of continuity and completion. You're seeing how some symbolic forms are so fundamentally human that they appear across cultures independently. Modern Christmas greenery is often artificial plastic holly, synthetic ivy, fake mistletoe that stays perfect and never drops leaves or berries. This shift from natural to artificial raises questions about whether the symbolism survives when the living plant doesn't. Does plastic evergreen still represent eternal life when it was never alive to begin with? Or does the visual similarity maintain the symbolic function regardless of material? These questions don't have definitive answers, but they highlight how Christmas traditions continue evolving, sometimes in ways that fundamentally alter their original meaning and purpose. You step back from your decorated home, surveying the greenery that transforms ordinary space into Christmas space, and recognize that these plants carry centuries of accumulated meaning. They're simultaneously pagan protective magic, Christian theological symbolism, romantic tradition, and aesthetic decoration. The holly doesn't know it represents both Saturn and Christ's passion. The mistletoe doesn't care whether you're honouring druids or following Victorian kissing games. The plants simply persist, green when everything else dies, offering their ancient assurance that life continues. Winter eventually ends, and the world will green again. Whether you interpret that message through pagan, Christian, or purely natural lenses matters less than the fundamental comfort the greenery provides. You're standing in a medieval European town square on a December evening, watching children place their shoes by the hearth with nervous excitement, hoping that tomorrow morning they'll find small gifts, nuts, or perhaps coal if they've been naughty. But the figure they're expecting isn't yet the jolly red-suited Santa Claus you recognize instead. You're meeting a confusing parade of gift-bringers with very different personalities, origins, and methods. The evolution from stern medieval saints through terrifying pagan gods to commercialized Christmas icon represents one of the holiday's strangest transformations. And you're about to trace Santa's genuinely bizarre ancestry. St. Nicholas of Myra provides the historical starting point, a 4th century bishop in what's now Turkey, who became legendary for his generosity, particularly toward children. The most famous story tells of Nicholas secretly providing dowries for 3 poor daughters by throwing bags of gold through their window, the gold supposedly landing in stockings or shoes drying by the fire. This tale established Nicholas as the patron saint of children, gift giver and protector of the vulnerable. You're meeting a real historical figure whose reputation for generosity grew into something approaching mythology within centuries of his death. Nicholas's feast day falls on December 6th, not Christmas Day, and throughout medieval and early modern Europe. This was when children received gifts and treats. You watch as families celebrate St. Nicholas Eve with the same excitement later. Cultures would reserve for Christmas Eve children cleaning their shoes to receive presents, leaving hay for Nicholas's horse, hoping their good behaviour throughout the year would be rewarded. The tradition was particularly strong in Germanic and Dutch regions, where Sinterklaas became a beloved figure combining religious veneration with folk custom. But Sinterklaas didn't arrive alone. He brought disturbing companions. You meet Krampus, the horned demonic figure who accompanies St. Nicholas in Alpine traditions, carrying chains and birch rods to punish naughty children. While Nicholas rewards the good with gifts, Krampus threatens the wicked with beatings or even abduction in his sack. The contrast couldn't be starker. Benevolent saint and literal demon working together, creating a good cop, bad cop routine that terrified and delighted children in equal measure. You're seeing how Christianity accommodated pagan figures by making them subservient to saints while retaining their frightening pagan characteristics. Krampus clearly descends from pre-Christian traditions, his goat-like appearance, his association with wild nature, his role as punisher of social transgressions all suggest pagan origins. Some scholars link him to ancient alpine winter spirits, others to Pan-like nature deities, still others to generic wild man folklore that appears across European cultures. The name Krampus possibly derives from the German word krampen, meaning claw, emphasizing his predatory nature. He's frightening but also carnivalesque. Krampus runs typically involved young men dressing as the demon and playfully threatening women and children, creating controlled chaos that inverted social norms temporarily. Other Nicholas companions fill similar roles across different regions. The Netherlands has Zwarte Piet, Black Pete, whose origins and racial implications generate significant modern controversy. Germany has Knecht Ruprecht, Belsnickel, or the Weihnachtsmann. France has Père Fouettard, Father Whipper. Iceland has the 13 Yule lads, each with specific pranks and mischief. You're discovering that the gift-bringing tradition almost universally includes not just reward but also threat, not just generosity but also judgment. The benevolent gift-giver rarely appears alone. He brings shadows, enforcers, reminders that children must behave or face consequences. Now you need to meet Odin, because the wild hunt you encountered during the Yule section contributes significantly to Santa's character. Odin rides through winter nights on an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, leading a procession of the dead, and crucially delivering both gifts and punishments to households based on their worthiness. Children in Germanic regions left boots filled with hay near the chimney for Sleipnir, and Odin would replace the hay with gifts if the children deserved reward. The parallels to later Santa traditions are unmistakable nocturnal winter flight, a magical horse, or eventually reindeer, gift-giving based on moral judgment, children leaving offerings, and the chimney connection. Odin was also called Yolner, Yule figure, and was associated specifically with midwinter celebrations. He wore a long beard dressed in a cloak and hood, and carried magical knowledge about who'd been good or bad throughout the year. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew throughout the world gathering information, essentially a pagan surveillance system that predates Santa's. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake by over a millennium. You're watching how a fearsome pagan god of war, death, and wisdom gradually transforms through Christianization into something more child-friendly, though Odin's fundamental character as judge and gift-giver persists. The transition from these various European figures to the American Santa Claus involves several key steps. Dutch settlers brought Sinterklaas traditions to New Amsterdam, later New York, where the name gradually morphed into Santa Claus through linguistic evolution and Anglicization. Washington Irving's satirical 1809 book, A History of New York, depicted a Dutch-style St. Nicholas flying over rooftops in a wagon, dropping presents down chimneys. Irving was partly inventing tradition, partly documenting actual Dutch customs, but his work significantly influenced American perception of this gift-bringing figure. The truly transformative moment came with Clement Clarke Moore's 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. You're reading the lines that established modern Santa iconography: the sleigh pulled by 8 named reindeer, the red-nosed, bearded figure, the midnight arrival, the chimney descent, the he knows if you've been bad or good surveillance, the belly that shakes like a bowl full of jelly. Moore borrowed from multiple traditions: Dutch Sinterklaas, Germanic Weihnachtsmann, Nordic Yule figures, even Nordic sled-pulling goats transformed into reindeer, and synthesized them into a single coherent character perfectly suited to American bourgeois domestic Christmas. Moore's Santa was explicitly jolly rather than stern, emphasizing reward over punishment, making him more purely benevolent than most European predecessors. The threatening companions Krampus, Knecht Ruprecht, and their ilk were dropped entirely from the American version. You're watching how New World optimism and emerging middle-class values transformed a complex figure embodying both reward and punishment into an almost entirely positive character. American Santa threatens coal in stockings but never beating abduction or demonic torment. He's been thoroughly domesticated, made safe for bourgeois parlors. Thomas Nast's illustrations in Harper's Weekly during the 1860s to 1880s further standardized Santa's appearance. Nast depicted Santa's North Pole workshop, his list-checking, his toy-making elves, and his general physical appearance rotund, bearded, suited. Nast was drawing during and after the Civil War, and his Santa supported Union soldiers, opposed slavery, and embodied northern middle-class values. You're seeing how Santa became not just a Christmas figure, but an American cultural icon representing specific social and political values, transformed from religious saint to secular symbol of generosity and childhood innocence. The red suit needs special attention because it generates persistent myths. Many people believe Coca-Cola invented Santa's red outfit through advertising campaigns in the 1930s. This is false. Santa wore red in numerous illustrations and descriptions before Coca-Cola's ads. However, Coca-Cola's massive advertising reach did standardize and popularize a specific version of red-suited Santa, making it the globally dominant image. You're watching how commercial interests amplify and spread cultural traditions, not creating them entirely but shaping them decisively through market power and media saturation. The reindeer require their own explanation because they're genuinely odd. Moore's original poem listed 8 reindeer: Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, and Blitzen, but Rudolph, the most famous, didn't appear until 1939, when the Montgomery Ward department store commissioned a children's story as a promotional giveaway. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was invented as marketing material, became wildly popular through a song in 1949 and got thoroughly absorbed into Christmas tradition despite being barely 80 years old. You're seeing how 20th century commercial innovation can create traditional elements that feel ancient but are actually younger than many living people. The reindeer themselves might descend from Nordic traditions about goats pulling Thor's chariot or sled-pulling animals in Sami culture. Reindeer are Arctic animals, making them appropriate for North Pole mythology, and their ability to survive harsh winters gave them symbolic associations with endurance and magic. The flying ability is pure fantasy. No traditional folklore suggests flying reindeer, but it solves the practical problem of how Santa delivers presents globally in a single night. You're watching how narrative needs drive mythological innovation even in modern commercial contexts. Santa's Toy Workshop and Elf Assistants are surprisingly recent additions, These elements emerge primarily in 19th and early 20th century American literature and illustration. European gift-bringers typically worked alone or with single companions. The industrial workshop with dozens of elves manufacturing toys reflects American industrialization and capitalist production models being projected onto Christmas mythology. Santa becomes a factory owner, children become consumers, and gift-giving becomes embedded in market economics. Whether this represents delightful fantasy or disturbing commercialization depends on your perspective, but it definitely transforms Santa from religious figure to secular economic actor. The naughty or nice surveillance system raises interesting questions about social control and childhood discipline. Santa's omniscient knowledge of children's behavior, he sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, creates a panopticon effect where children self-regulate behavior because they might always be watched. Some critics argue this represents disturbing indoctrination in surveillance culture. Others counter that it's harmless myth encouraging good behavior through magical thinking. The debate reflects broader anxieties about childhood, discipline, and how societies transmit moral values across generations. Modern Santa has become almost entirely secularized. He appears in contexts having nothing to do with Christianity, sells products unrelated to Christmas, and serves as a generic symbol of generosity, winter, and gift-giving. You're watching how a Christian saint transformed through pagan influences into a commercial icon that transcends any particular religious tradition. Santa belongs to consumer culture now more than to Christianity or paganism, which might represent cultural loss or adaptive evolution depending on your values. As you watch modern children approach mall Santas, whispering wish lists and sitting nervously on strangers' laps while parents photograph the encounter, you recognize how far Santa has travelled from 4th century Myra. He's absorbed St. Nicholas's generosity, Odin's winter flight and judgment, Sinterklaas's gift-giving, Krampus's behavioural enforcement though sanitized, and American commercial culture's emphasis on abundance and consumer desire. He's simultaneously ancient and modern, pagan and Christian and secular. Myth and marketing, Santa embodies Christmas's essential hybrid nature, a figure who makes sense only by accepting that he contains multitudes, contradictions, and centuries of accumulated cultural baggage that somehow coheres into a character billions of people recognize instantly. You're sitting at a medieval feast table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced puddings, honeyed cakes, and enough ale and wine to drown a small village. The hall smells of wood smoke, animal fat, and cinnamon exotic and expensive, signalling that this meal represents something far beyond ordinary sustenance. You're about to discover that Christmas feasting traditions carry some of the most direct and unambiguous connections to pagan winter celebrations, because the human need to eat abundantly when winter threatens scarcity transcends religious boundaries completely. Food is theology you can taste, and December's table tells stories older than Christianity itself. The timing of the feast matters enormously, too. Winter solstice arrives when agricultural work has ceased, when the harvest is fully stored, when certain livestock must be slaughtered because feeding them through winter costs more than their eventual value. You're understanding the brutal economics of pre-industrial farming animals consume stored grain and hay all winter, resources needed for human survival. Better to slaughter now, preserve what meat you can, and feast on what you can't. This creates natural abundance precisely at midwinter, making feasting not just celebratory but practically inevitable. The pagans feasted for these reasons, and Christians inherited the same agricultural calendar that made December dining naturally extravagant. The boar holds pride of place at many medieval Christmas tables, and its presence is gloriously, obviously pagan. You've already encountered boar as sacred to Freya in Norse tradition, but the animal appears in Celtic, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon contexts as powerful, dangerous, worthy of respect. Hunting wild boar was aristocratic sport and serious danger. These animals could kill experienced hunters with their tusks. Serving roasted boar demonstrated wealth, hunting prowess, and connection to ancient traditions that Christianity never fully displaced. The boar's head particularly became ceremonial, carried into halls with great pageantry, sometimes with an apple in its mouth, garnished with bay and rosemary, while diners sang the boar's head carol. The carol deserves a moment of attention. The boar's head in hand bear I bedecked with bays and rosemary, and I pray you, my masters, be merry. Quot estis in convivio. The Latin phrase means as many as are in the feast, and the entire song celebrates the boar's entrance as the pinnacle of Christmas celebration. You're singing words that connect medieval Christian England to pre-Christian sacrificial feasts, where the boar wasn't just food but offering, where consuming sacred animals transferred their power to the community. The Christianity is a thin veneer over practices that echo sacrifices to Freya, offerings to ensure fertility and abundance in the coming agricultural year. Geese, swans, peacocks, and other fowl also graced wealthy tables, often prepared elaborately and redressed in their feathers for visual drama. You watch as cooks roast a peacock, then carefully reattach its iridescent plumage so the bird appears merely sleeping rather than dead, creating an edible sculpture that announces the host's wealth and whimsy. This isn't about sustenance, you're eating theatre, consuming status. The Christmas feast became an arena for competitive display where aristocrats and wealthy merchants proved their social standing through culinary excess that would feed ordinary families for months. Mince pie carries its own strange journey from savoury to sweet, from genuine meat filling to fruit and spice mixture that rarely contains actual mincemeat anymore. Medieval mince pies included mutton or beef mixed with dried fruits, suet, and expensive spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. The spices were crucial. They came from distant lands, cost enormous sums, and their presence in food announced that you had money to literally eat luxuries that most people would never taste. Early mince pies were often baked in rectangular shapes meant to represent Jesus' manger, with a pastry baby Jesus placed on top, making them simultaneously food and religious icon. Eating mince pies accrued its own superstitions. You were supposed to eat one pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas, for good luck in the coming year. Refusing mince pie offered by a host brought bad luck to both parties. Some regions believed that eating mince pie in silence while making a wish would grant that wish. You're watching food become magical, where consumption performs spiritual work beyond mere nutrition. These beliefs probably have pre-Christian roots in the idea that what you eat at crucial calendar moments influences the entire coming year, a sympathetic magic that survives Christianization intact. Plum pudding, that dense, dark, fruit-studded creation that's more weapon than dessert, has its origins in medieval pottages and porridges that gradually became sweeter and more elaborate. By the Victorian era, plum pudding had become essential Christmas fare in Britain, prepared weeks in advance on Stir-Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, when every family member stirred the mixture while making a wish, adding coins or trinkets that would bring luck to whoever found them in their slice. The pudding was flambéed at table, doused in brandy and set alight, creating dramatic blue flames that transformed dessert into spectacle. The hidden objects in pudding coins, thimbles, rings connect to ancient practices of hiding beans in cakes to select the king of Saturnalia or Twelfth Night celebrations. You're finding the Lord of Misrule tradition persisting through baked goods, where random luck determines temporary royalty and objects found in food carry divinatory meaning. This is fortune-telling through dessert, prophecy via pudding, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with Christian theology, even though it happens at Christian celebrations. Wassail deserves special attention, this hot spiced cider or ale, often with roasted apples floating in it, was carried door to door by carolers who expected to be invited in for a drink and perhaps some coins or food. The word derives from Old Norse veshael, meaning be healthy, and the tradition involved toasting orchards to ensure good apple harvests. You'd go into the orchard at night, pour wassail on tree roots, place wassail-soaked toast in branches, and sing to the trees, waking them from winter sleep and encouraging them to bear fruit abundantly. This is absolutely unambiguously pagan. It's agricultural magic, singing and drinking to ensure fertility, making offerings to trees. Christianity tried to Christianize wassailing by adding religious songs and redirecting the toast toward human health, rather than tree fertility. But the practice remained stubbornly pagan in feel and function. The modern tradition of going caroling and expecting treats or hot drinks descends directly from wassailing. Though most carolers no longer sing to apple trees or pour cider on roots, you're watching how a pagan agricultural ritual transforms into Christian charity practice, then into secular community entertainment, all while retaining the basic structure of going door-to-door singing and receiving refreshment. The Christmas ham puzzles you because pigs are biblically unclean in Jewish tradition, yet Christmas supposedly celebrates a Jewish baby's birth. Why would Christians emphasize pork so heavily at Christmas? The answer lies partly in pagan inheritance, the boar sacred to Freya, and partly in Christian differentiation from Judaism. By the Middle Ages, eating pork at Christian festivals actively signalled Christian identity as distinct from Jewish practice. The ham became theological statement disguised as dinner, announcing that Christians were free from Old Testament dietary laws and could consume what Jews could not. You're tasting religious identity politics on your plate. The Yule log cake bûche de Noel represents another example of food imitating earlier traditions. This chocolate cake, shaped and decorated to resemble a wooden log, commemorates the Yule log you encountered in Norse traditions, transforming an actual burning log into edible confection. It's a 19th century French invention, proof that even relatively modern innovations can memorialize ancient practices. You're eating memory, consuming tradition in chocolate and buttercream form, participating in cultural continuity through cake. Gingerbread appears in various forms: cookies, houses, figures, and its association with Christmas connects partly to the spices that made it expensive and special, worthy of festive occasions. But gingerbread houses specifically reference the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, with its witch's candy house in the forest. You're building edible architecture that commemorates a story about danger, hunger, and cannibalism, oddly dark themes for Christmas. Yet children adore constructing and then destroying these spice structures. The tradition might connect to pre-Christian practices of building symbolic houses for spirits or gods, offering them shelter during winter, though the evidence for this connection remains speculative. Candy canes carry heavy Christian symbolism in modern interpretation, the J-shape supposedly representing Jesus, the white symbolizing purity, the red representing Christ's blood, the peppermint flavor evoking hyssop used in biblical purification. However, historians find no evidence that candy canes were created with these meanings. They were simply hooked sugar sticks, convenient for hanging on trees, made festive with peppermint flavor and red stripes. The Christian symbolism appears to be entirely retroactive. invented in the 20th century to give Christian meaning to a secular candy, you're encountering false history designed to Christianize something that was always just delicious, shaped conveniently, and commercially successful. The feast's social dimensions matter as much as the specific foods. Medieval Christmas feasts temporarily dissolved social hierarchies. Lords served tenants, wealthy fed poor. Social superiors acknowledged obligations to inferiors through food hospitality. You're experiencing Saturnalia's role reversal continuing in Christian context, where the normal social order suspends and abundance gets shared, however briefly and incompletely, across class boundaries. This tradition had revolutionary potential if peasants could feast in the Lord's Hall once yearly. Why not always, which may be why it gradually diminished as class consciousness and capitalism made elites nervous about any social levelling, even temporary and symbolic. The modern Christmas dinner turkey or ham, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie represents particularly American evolution of these traditions. Turkey replaced goose or boar as the centerpiece because turkeys were Native American birds, large enough to feed big gatherings, and not useful for eggs or dairy like chickens and cows. You're eating a bird that indigenous Americans domesticated, prepared with techniques and sides that blend European and American ingredients, creating a hybrid meal that reflects colonial and immigrant food cultures merging into something new. The timing shift from December 25th dinner to Christmas Eve feast in some cultures, or to Christmas Day lunch versus dinner in others, shows how even eating schedules carry cultural meaning. When you eat matters almost as much as what you eat, the meal's position in the day says something about whether Christmas is a solemn holy day beginning with church, or a secular family celebration centered on children and presents. You're watching theology encoded in dinner hour. Food waste and excess at Christmas have long troubled religious authorities who valued fasting and moderation. You read medieval sermons denouncing gluttony during Christmas, Puritan denunciations of drunken revelry, modern concerns about overconsumption and food waste. The feast contains within itself the seeds of its own critique, celebrating abundance in a world of scarcity, encouraging excess when many go hungry, making Christmas about consumption rather than spiritual reflection. These tensions haven't been resolved. They've simply become accepted contradictions within the holiday. As you lean back from the table, uncomfortably full, loosening your belt and contemplating whether you can manage one more slice of pie, you understand that Christmas feasting is perhaps the holiday's most pagan element precisely because it's the most human. Humans facing winter scarcity have always feasted when possible, have always marked the darkest days with whatever abundance they could muster, have always gathered around shared food to strengthen community bonds. Christians didn't invent this. They inherited it from pagans who inherited it from pre-agricultural humans who inherited it from evolutionary ancestors who learned that sharing food creates social cohesion. The Christmas feast is ancient beyond religion, and that's exactly why it survives every theological transformation intact. You're standing in Oliver Cromwell's England during the 1640s and 1650s, watching Puritan authorities do something that seems almost unthinkable. They're banning Christmas. Not just discouraging it, not just frowning upon excess, but actually outlawing the celebration of December 25th as the holy day, closing shops that dare to close for the holiday, and prosecuting people caught feasting or decorating. You're about to discover that Christmas's supposed pagan origins weren't just academic debates, they became ammunition in religious wars where the holiday itself was contested, banned, and had to fight for survival. The Puritan objection to Christmas was multifaceted and genuinely theological, not mere killjoy spite as popular caricature suggests. First, Puritans noted correctly that the Bible nowhere commands Christians to celebrate Christ's birth, never mentions December 25th, and shows no evidence that early Christians marked the Nativity as a special day. If God wanted Christians to celebrate Christmas, surely he would have said so explicitly in Scripture. The holiday's absence from biblical command made it. In Puritan thinking, a human invention without divine sanction, and humans shouldn't add requirements to Christian practice beyond what God explicitly mandated. Second, Puritans recognized accurately that many Christmas customs derived from or resembled pagan festivals. The evergreen decorations, the feasting and drinking, the revelry and social disorder, the emphasis on gifts and material abundance. All of this looked suspiciously like Saturnalia to educated Puritans who'd studied Roman history. They saw through the Christian veneer to pagan practices beneath. And they weren't wrong. You're watching religious reformers who took seriously the command to avoid pagan contamination, who believed that accommodating pagan customs, even with Christian reinterpretation, compromised the faith's purity. Third, Puritans were genuinely scandalized by how Christmas was actually celebrated in early modern England. The holiday had become an extended festival of drinking, gambling, sexual license, social inversion, and rowdy disorder that bore little resemblance to sober religious observance. You witness Christmas lords and lords of misrule leading processions of masked revellers through streets, demanding food and drink from householders, sometimes threatening property damage if refused. This was wassailing gone aggressive. Community celebration turned into semi-threatening carnival that made respectable Puritans deeply uncomfortable. The specific activities Puritans condemned paint a picture of Christmas as genuinely wild. You see Morris dancing men in costume with bells on their legs, performing dances with pagan fertility ritual origins, and Jvundor. You watch mummers performing plays featuring Father Christmas, St. George, Turkish Nights, and Dragons Theatre that mix Christian and pagan elements indiscriminately. You witness the Feast of Fools, where clergy elected a mock pope or bishop who presided over services featuring obscene parodies of religious ritual, gambling and drinking in church, and general sacrilege performed as sanctioned entertainment. The Lord of Misrule tradition particularly offended Puritan sensibilities. This figure, elected by lot or popular acclaim, was given temporary authority to command ridiculous or transgressive acts, inverting normal hierarchy and mocking social order. In some communities, the Lord of Misrule could enter any house, demand food and drink, require people to perform embarrassing tasks, and generally create controlled chaos. This was Saturnalia's role reversal surviving in Christian guise. And Puritans correctly identified it as pagan practice that Christianity had absorbed rather than transformed. The decision to ban Christmas wasn't sudden or arbitrary. You're watching decades of increasing Puritan influence in Parliament culminating in an ordinance in 1644 replacing Christmas and other holy days with monthly fast days. In 1647, Parliament formally abolished the celebration of Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, declaring them superstitious observances without biblical warrant. The law required shops to stay open on December 25th, banned special church services, and prohibited feasting or special food preparation. Essentially, Christmas was supposed to become an ordinary work day indistinguishable from any other. The backlash was immediate and intense. You witness riots in Canterbury, Ipswich, and other towns when authorities tried to enforce the ban. Crowds attacked shops that opened on Christmas, defended their right to feast and celebrate, and sometimes fought pitched battles with soldiers sent to suppress Christmas observances. The violence reveals how deeply Christmas had embedded itself in English culture. People would literally fight for their right to celebrate, despite Parliament's prohibition. This wasn't just about religion, it was about cultural identity, communal tradition, and the popular classes resisting elite moral reform. Some defied the ban openly. You watch clandestine Christmas services held in private homes, with lookouts posted to warn of approaching authorities. Families feasted behind locked doors and shuttered windows, performing forbidden traditions in secret like early Christians in Roman catacombs. The irony is rich Christians now hiding their Christian holiday from other Christians who deemed it insufficiently Christian. You're seeing how the question of what constitutes authentic Christianity generates violence and persecution even among people who agree on core doctrines like Christ's divinity and resurrection. The Puritan ban extended to America, where similar attitudes prevailed in New England colonies. Massachusetts made Christmas celebration a criminal offence in 1659, with violators facing fines for feasting or refraining from work on December 25th. You're watching Puritan colonists export their anti-Christmas stance to the New World, creating an American tradition of Christmas skepticism that would persist for generations. Even after legal bans lifted, many New Englanders continued viewing Christmas as either dangerously Catholic or frivolously pagan well into the 19th century. The theological argument against Christmas purity wasn't entirely unreasonable. Puritans asked a fair question if Christianity is supposed to be based solely on biblical teaching, and the Bible doesn't mandate Christmas. Why should churches require or even encourage its observance? Their answer they shouldn't was logically consistent with their principle of sola scriptura, scripture alone as the basis for Christian practice. Every tradition not explicitly commanded in the Bible represented potential corruption, human invention replacing divine instruction. Christmas, lacking biblical mandate and carrying obvious pagan DNA, was Exhibit A for how Christianity had strayed from apostolic purity. The Catholic and Anglican responses to Puritan criticism defended Christmas using different reasoning. They argued that church tradition carried authority alongside Scripture, that Christians were free to establish celebrations honouring Christ even if not biblically commanded, and that Christianizing pagan customs demonstrated Christianity's power to transform and redeem cultural practices, rather than merely fleeing from them. You're watching competing theories of how Christianity should relate to surrounding culture, Puritan separatism versus Catholic Anglican accommodation and transformation. The debate had class dimensions often overlooked. Puritan reformers were disproportionately educated, urban, middle class, the sort of people horrified by drunken peasants demanding entry to their homes while dressed as animals. The defence of Christmas came partly from aristocrats who enjoyed the feasting and theatre, and partly from common people who loved the rare opportunity for excess, social inversion, and community celebration. Banning Christmas was, among other things, an attempt by an emergent middle class to impose their values of sobriety, industry, and order on both the aristocracy and the labouring poor. The ban didn't survive. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and Charles II took the throne, Christmas returned triumphantly. You watch English people celebrating Christmas with extra enthusiasm specifically to repudiate Puritan austerity, to reclaim cultural practices that had been suppressed, to assert that traditional English identity included Christmas, regardless of its theological justification. The holiday's restoration wasn't primarily about theology. It was about rejecting the Puritan vision of society in favour of older patterns of celebration and community. But Christmas emerged from its Puritan exile changed. The most raucous elements, the aggressive, were sailing. The Feast of Fools, the Lords of Misrule, never fully recovered. The restored Christmas was somewhat tamer, more domesticated, shifting from public street carnival toward private family celebration. You're watching the Puritan critique partially succeed even in failure, moderating Christmas excess even though it couldn't eliminate the holiday entirely. The Victorian Christmas that would emerge 2 centuries later, sentimental, domestic, child-centred, was partially shaped by Puritan concerns about disorder and pagan contamination, even as it rejected outright prohibition in America. Christmas remained controversial longer than in England. You watch as different colonies and later states approach Christmas differently. Anglicans in Virginia celebrated it. Puritans in Massachusetts rejected it. German immigrants in Pennsylvania brought their traditions. Catholics maintained their observances. Christmas wasn't a federal holiday in the United States until 1870, and even then, some Protestant denominations continued opposing it as Romish superstition. The holiday's acceptance in America required both increasing immigrant populations who brought Christmas traditions and the Victorian cultural transformation that made Christmas seem respectable and properly Protestant. The Scottish Presbyterian Kirk maintained even harsher opposition to Christmas than English Puritans, banning the holiday so effectively that Scotland didn't make Christmas a public holiday until 1958. You're discovering that well into the 20th century. Many Scots worked on December 25th and celebrated Hogmanay New Year as their main winter festival instead. This represents the Puritan anti-Christmas position's most lasting victory in an entire nation, where Christmas simply wasn't celebrated for centuries, where the alternative of emphasizing New Year rather than Christ's birth became culturally dominant. The Puritan episode reveals something important about Christmas's contested nature reasonable. Sincere Christians could argue that the holiday was dangerously pagan and should be eliminated. This wasn't ignorant prejudice. These were educated theologians who'd examined the evidence and concluded that Christmas represented unacceptable accommodation with paganism. They lost the debate not because their historical analysis was wrong, they were largely correct about pagan influences, but because most Christians decided that Christianizing pagan customs was acceptable or even desirable. That cultural continuity mattered more than absolute purity, and that people simply loved Christmas too much to abandon it. The irony is delicious. Christmas survived its most serious threat not from pagans or secularists, but from Christians who thought it was insufficiently Christian. The holiday proved more durable than the reform movement that tried to kill it, partly because Christmas had become woven into cultural identity beyond just religion, and partly because humans stubbornly insist on celebrating Midwinter, regardless of theological permission. The Puritan ban demonstrated both Christmas's pagan roots, which justified opposition, and its deep cultural entrenchment, which made opposition futile. As you watch the Puritan experiment collapse and Christmas return to England's calendar, you understand that the question is Christmas pagan could legitimately lead to opposite conclusions. Yes, it's pagan enough that serious Christians once banned it, and no, it survived that ban and remained fundamentally Christian in believers' minds despite pagan influences. The Puritan episode proves that Christmas's relationship to paganism was obvious enough to generate violent conflict, yet ambiguous enough that the holiday could survive and even thrive after being caught between competing religious visions of cultural purity. You're sitting in a drafty London parlour in 1843 reading a newly published novella called A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and you're experiencing one of the most powerful cultural transformations in Christmas history. The holiday that Puritans tried to kill, that had languished in England as a minor observance overshadowed by other festivals, is about to be resurrected, reimagined, and repackaged into something that feels both ancient and utterly new. You're watching the Victorians essentially invent modern Christmas, creating traditions they believed were timeless, but were actually products of their own era's anxieties, values, and commercial possibilities. The Christmas Dickens encountered in the early Victorian period was diminished, almost forgotten in many English communities. The Puritan suppression had broken Christmas's cultural momentum, and the Industrial Revolution's disruption of agricultural rhythms had severed many connections between midwinter celebrations and the farming calendar that once made December feasting practically inevitable. Workers in factories didn't slaughter livestock or finish harvests. They simply worked year-round at machines that cared nothing for seasons. Christmas had become optional, regional, inconsistent. Many urban working-class families barely observed it at all. A Christmas Carol changed everything. You're reading Dickens' story of Ebenezer Scrooge, a miser transformed by ghostly visitations into a generous, joyful celebrant of Christmas, and you're encountering a deliberate project of holiday reconstruction. Dickens wasn't just writing entertainment, he was arguing that Christmas should be revived, that it served essential social functions by encouraging charity, family bonds, and temporary transcendence of class divisions. His Christmas is explicitly Christian in its moral framework, but deliberately vague about religious observance. You don't see the Cratchit family attending church. You see them gathered around a meagre goose, expressing love and gratitude despite poverty. The novella's extraordinary success, 6,000 copies sold in the first week. Multiple theatrical adaptations within months demonstrated massive appetite for exactly this vision of Christmas. Readers and audiences embraced Dickens' message that Christmas should involve generosity to the poor, celebration with family, special food despite economic hardship, and emotional warmth that temporarily melts social ice. You're watching a single piece of literature reshape cultural practice, giving people permission and vocabulary to celebrate Christmas in ways that felt both morally righteous and emotionally satisfying. But Dickens didn't work alone. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German husband, imported Christmas tree traditions from his homeland in the 1840s, and the royal family's celebrations received extensive press coverage that made these customs fashionable throughout Britain. You see illustrations of the royal family around their tree published in newspapers and magazines, creating aspirational images that middle-class families rush to emulate. If the Queen decorates a tree, surely respectable families should too. The royal endorsement gave Christmas legitimacy, making it patriotic rather than merely traditional or pagan. The Christmas card emerged in this same period. Sir Henry Cole commissioned the first commercial Christmas card in 1843, the same year as A Christmas Carol, featuring a family toast and charitable images. The practice exploded with the development of the penny post in 1840, which made mailing cards affordable for middle-class families. You're watching how technological innovation, cheap postal service enables social innovation, sending seasonal greetings to extended family and acquaintances. Christmas cards became a way to maintain social networks, demonstrate literacy and cultural sophistication, and participate in the modern Christmas that was rapidly becoming mandatory for respectable Victorians. The carol-singing tradition revived dramatically during Victorian times. Medieval and early modern carols had existed, but many were bawdy drinking songs or were sailing demands rather than the sentimental, religious compositions Victorians preferred. You watch as editors compiled carol collections, sometimes improving older lyrics to remove objectionable content, sometimes writing entirely new carols while claiming ancient origins. Good King Wenceslas, Once in Royal David City, and O Little Town of Bethlehem are Victorian compositions, not ancient hymns, though they're performed today as though they've existed forever. The Victorian Christmas dinner became an elaborately staged production quite different from medieval feasting. You're no longer witnessing lords sharing halls with peasants or boars' heads paraded with pagan resonance. Instead, You see middle-class families gathered in private dining rooms, consuming turkey or goose-not boar, plum pudding, mince pies, and other foods that signal respectable abundance without aristocratic excess. The meal is emphatically domestic, focused on the nuclear family rather than extended community, reflecting Victorian values about home as moral refuge from the corrupt public world of commerce and industry. The Christmas stocking tradition solidified during this period, connecting to St. Nicholas legends but given new emphasis and elaborate ritual. Children hung stockings by the fireplace. Parents filled them with small gifts, oranges, nuts, and perhaps a lump of coal if the child had misbehaved. You're watching the emergence of Christmas as fundamentally a children's holiday. This is new. Medieval and early modern Christmas was primarily adult celebration with children as participants but not focal points. Victorian Christmas made children central, both as recipients of gifts and as symbols of innocence that adults sought to preserve or recapture. This child-centered transformation reflected broader Victorian anxieties about childhood, industrialization, and maintaining innocence in a rapidly modernizing world. You see middle-class Victorians treating childhood as a special protected period requiring safeguarding from adult knowledge and harsh realities. Christmas became a tool for this project, a time when adults could create magical experiences for children, temporarily returning to lost innocence themselves while ensuring their children experienced wonder. The gifts, the tree, the stories about Santa, the insistence on belief, all of this served the Victorian project of maintaining childhood as an innocent sanctuary. Charles Dickens's other Christmas books, The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, The Haunted Man continued developing his Christmas vision throughout the 1840s, though none matched A Christmas Carol's impact. Together, these works established Christmas as a season for ghost stories, for moral transformation, for charitable thoughts toward the poor, and for nostalgic longing for simpler times. The phrase Dickensian Christmas entered the language, representing an idealized past that never quite existed but that Victorians created through determined celebration. The commercialization of Christmas accelerated dramatically during Victoria's reign. Department stores emerged in major cities, offering entire floors dedicated to Christmas goods toys, decorations, cards, specialized foods. You watch as shops begin elaborate Christmas window displays designed to enchant children and tempt parents into purchases. The relationship between Christmas and commerce became increasingly intertwined, to the point where critics complained that the holiday was being corrupted by materialism, losing its religious meaning to consumer culture. These complaints are over 150 years old. The tension between sacred and commercial Christmas is Victorian, not postmodern. The timing of gift-giving shifted during this period. Traditionally, gifts were exchanged on New Year's Day or Twelfth Night, not Christmas Day itself. The Victorians moved gift-giving to Christmas morning, connecting it more explicitly to Christ's nativity and the Magi's gifts. This change required reinterpreting when and why gifts were exchanged, and it successfully made Christmas the primary gift-giving occasion, overshadowing the new year and effectively extending the commercial season from a single day to an entire weeks-long shopping period before December 25th. The idea of Christmas spirit, that special feeling of generosity, kindness, and goodwill toward others, is fundamentally Victorian. You encounter this concept repeatedly in literature, sermons, and popular writing from the period. Christmas spirit wasn't described as religious devotion or theological understanding, but as an emotional state combining charity, nostalgia, family love, and seasonal cheer. This secular emotional framework allowed people of varying or minimal religious commitments to participate authentically in Christmas, celebrating the feeling rather than requiring specific doctrinal beliefs. The Victorian Christmas also involved deliberate antiquarianism, collecting and reviving old customs that might have been partially or entirely invented. You watch folklorists and writers combing through medieval records, finding mentions of wassailing, boars' heads, Yule logs, and other practices, then encouraging contemporary revival. Sometimes these revivals were historically accurate. Often they were romanticized, sanitized, or partially fabricated. The Victorians wanted to believe their Christmas was ancient and traditional, connecting them to an idealized pre-industrial past, even as they were fundamentally creating a new Victorian Christmas that previous generations wouldn't recognize. This relationship to the past was complex and sometimes contradictory. Victorians simultaneously celebrated progress their empire industry and modern conveniences while expressing nostalgia for a rural, pre-industrial England they imagined as morally superior. Christmas became a vehicle for this nostalgia, a yearly return to imagined traditional values of community, generosity, and simple pleasures. The fact that this traditional Christmas was largely a Victorian invention didn't matter. It felt authentic, and emotional truth trumped historical accuracy. The Victorian revival of Christmas spread globally through Britain's empire and through American cultural connections to British fashion. You watch as British colonial administrators, missionaries, and settlers export Victorian Christmas to India, Africa, Australia, and beyond, often imposing snow-associated imagery and traditions in tropical climates where they made no environmental sense. The absurdity of Christmas trees in Australian summer or snow imagery in African celebrations demonstrates how thoroughly Victorian Christmas became synonymous with Christmas itself, exporting not just a holiday but a specific cultural package. In America, similar transformations occurred slightly later and with different emphases. Washington Irving's writings in the 1820s had begun romanticizing Old English Christmas traditions, creating nostalgic fiction about harmonious celebrations in country manners. His work influenced American perceptions of what Christmas should be. Though widespread adoption waited until mid-century, the Civil War period and after saw accelerated Christmas adoption as Americans sought unifying cultural traditions, and the Victorian model family-centered, child-focused, gift-giving, sentimental appeal to middle-class values on both sides of the Atlantic. The temperance movement influenced Victorian Christmas in England and especially in America. Reformers who wanted to eliminate or reduce alcohol consumption promoted family Christmas celebrations as alternatives to public drunkenness. You see Christmas reimagined as a sober family occasion where children's presence naturally discourages adult excess. This represents a dramatic shift from the alcoholic celebrations Puritans had condemned. Christmas was being domesticated, privatized, and made respectable precisely by removing it from public spaces and male drinking culture into private homes where women and children dominated. Religious leaders had mixed reactions to the Victorian Christmas revival. Some welcomed renewed observance of Christ's birth and the emphasis on charity and family. Others worried that the holiday was becoming too commercial, too focused on gifts and food rather than on religious devotion. The tension between sacred and secular Christmas, between religious holy day and cultural festival, was already apparent by the late Victorian period. Churches promoted religious services and nativity pageants while competing with secular attractions like shopping, parties, and theatrical entertainments. The Victorian Christmas succeeded in making the holiday culturally mandatory by century's end. Not celebrating Christmas marked you as outside mainstream society. This was new. Previously, Christmas observance had been optional, regional, class-specific. The Victorians democratized and universalized Christmas, making it something that everyone, regardless of class or specific religious commitment, was expected to observe. This universalization required secularizing elements, making Christmas about family, generosity, and seasonal cheer, rather than exclusively about Christian theology, which paradoxically ensured its survival and expansion. As you close your Victorian novel and blow out the candles on your Christmas tree carefully, to avoid fire, you recognize that the Christmas you know, the trees, cards, carols, family dinners, child-centered gift-giving, and sentimental emotional tone is fundamentally Victorian. The Victorians didn't invent Christmas from nothing, but they resurrected it, reshaped it, and sold it so successfully that their version became the global standard. Whether this represents cultural creativity or commercial manipulation depends on your perspective, but it undeniably demonstrates that traditions feeling ancient and unchangeable can be largely products of recent innovation, and that sometimes the most effective way to preserve something is to completely transform it. You're sitting in a university library surrounded by thick academic journals and monographs, listening to historians argue passionately about whether early Christians deliberately chose December 25th to compete with pagan festivals, or whether the date emerged independently from internal Christian calculations. This isn't a settled question. It's an active scholarly debate where smart people examining the same evidence reach opposite conclusions. You're about to discover why this matters more than academic hair-splitting, because how we understand Christmas's origins shapes how we interpret the holiday's meaning and authenticity today. The Christianity borrowed from paganism camp presents compelling circumstantial evidence. You examine their argument, December 25th falls suspiciously close to winter solstice, the date when multiple pagan festivals celebrated the sun's return. Sol Invictus was celebrated on December the 25th starting in 274 CE under Emperor Aurelian. Saturnalia dominated the week before. Mithras worshippers honoured their god around the same time. The clustering of pagan solar festivals around this date seems too convenient for Christian choice of December 25th to be coincidental. If you wanted to convert pagans, offering them a Christian alternative to beloved festivals on the same calendar dates would be strategically brilliant. The evidence of cultural continuity strengthens this interpretation. You observe that Christmas absorbed customs, evergreen decorations, gift-giving, feasting, Yule logs that clearly predate Christianity and have obvious pagan origins. If Christians borrowed customs, why not dates too? The methodology seems consistent. Take what pagans loved, keep the appealing elements, change the theological meaning. And you've got a conversion strategy that minimizes cultural disruption while maximizing religious transformation. It's pragmatic, even cynical, but undeniably effective if accurate. Historians in this camp point to 4th century context. Christianity became Rome's favoured religion under Constantine, creating both opportunity and necessity for accommodating pagan populations. You're examining the period when December the 25th Christmas becomes clearly documented and widely observed exactly when you'd expect strategic dating decisions if conversion was the priority. The timing suggests political calculation rather than ancient tradition suddenly emerging into documentation. These scholars argue that Christmas's official establishment during the Constantinian era reveals its fundamentally political rather than purely theological origins. But the opposing camp scholars who argue Christmas's date emerged independently from pagan festivals presents equally compelling evidence. You read their central argument early. Christians calculated December 25th using the integral age theory, which held that great prophets died on their conception dates. Since Jesus's supposedly died on March 25th calculated from Passover dating, he must have been conceived on March 25th, making his birth 9 months later on December 25th. This calculation appears in Christian writings before Saul Invictus was officially established on December 25th, suggesting Christians arrived at the date first. These historians emphasize that early Christian writings discussing December 25th, particularly from Hippolytus around 204 CE and Julius Africanus around 221 CE, show no awareness of competing with pagan festivals. If the date was chosen strategically to override paganism, surely someone would have mentioned this explicitly. The silence suggests the calculation was genuinely internal to Christian chronological concerns, not reactive to pagan practice. You're examining what scholars call the argument from silence, the absence of evidence as potentially meaningful. Though this methodology remains controversial, the Eastern Christian tradition complicates the debate further. You discover that many Eastern churches calculated Jesus' death and conception as April 6th, using identical methodology, arriving at January 6th for the Nativity, which is still celebrated as Christmas in some Orthodox traditions. The existence of two separate dates calculated via the same theological method suggests the dating wasn't about competing with pagans, but about different starting assumptions regarding crucifixion timing. If strategic anti-paganism was the goal, why didn't all Christians coordinate on a single date? Historians still argue whether the integral age theory was genuinely believed or represented post hoc rationalization. Skeptics note that the theory appears conveniently when Christians needed to establish a birth date, and it involves symbolic reasoning more than historical analysis. The March 25th crucifixion date itself is uncertain. Different Gospels provide different Passover timing, and reconciling Jewish and Roman calendars remains complex. The entire calculation could be Christian theologians working backward from a desired December 25th conclusion, inventing methodology to justify a date chosen for other reasons, primarily pagan competition. The remarkable coincidence interpretation suggests both Christians and pagans independently arrived at late December for different but understandable reasons. Winter solstice naturally attracts celebration because it marks the sun's return. This is observable, astronomical fact requiring no religious transmission. Christians might have genuinely calculated December 25th, while pagans simultaneously celebrated solar festivals, with the convergence being coincidental rather than causal. You're examining whether it's possible for separate traditions to develop similar practices independently, which anthropologists generally affirm happens regularly across cultures. Some scholars propose a middle position: Christians calculated December the 25th independently, but once they noticed it coincided with pagan festivals, they embraced this as providential rather than problematic. The overlap allowed easier conversion of pagans, while Christians could maintain that their date had authentic theological origins. This interpretation suggests neither pure appropriation nor pure coincidence, but rather opportunistic synthesis. Christians took advantage of convenient timing without that timing being their primary motivation. You're watching how historical truth might resist simple either-or categories. The debate extends to Christmas customs beyond dating. Some historians argue that practices like Christmas trees, evergreen decorations, gift-giving, and special feasting were deliberately borrowed from paganism as conversion strategies. Others contend these customs emerged naturally from universal human responses to winter bringing greenery indoors, sharing food abundance before scarcity, marking seasonal transitions with ritual. The question becomes whether similar practices across cultures prove borrowing or simply demonstrate common human patterns. You're encountering fundamental methodological questions about how to interpret cultural similarities. The symbolic resonance argument suggests Christians chose December 25th not to compete with specific pagan festivals, but because winter solstice timing carried powerful metaphorical meaning. Christ as light of the world being born when literal daylight begins increasing creates beautiful symbolism that early Christians would have appreciated. This interpretation allows the date to be both meaningfully Christian and conveniently aligned with existing festivals without requiring direct competitive intent. You're seeing how symbolism can drive decisions that appear strategic without necessarily being consciously so. Archaeological evidence provides limited help because material culture doesn't easily reveal motivations. You examine 4th century churches, Christian artifacts and inscriptions, but these show Christians celebrating December 25th without explaining why they chose this date. The objects demonstrate practice without illuminating decision-making processes. Historians face the frustrating reality that ancient people rarely documented their reasoning for cultural choices that seemed obvious to them, leaving later scholars to reconstruct motivations from fragmentary clues. The role of Sol Invictus receives particular scrutiny. Some scholars question whether Sol Invictus was ever as culturally dominant as the Christmas appropriation theory requires. You discover that evidence for widespread Sol Invictus celebration on December the 25th before Christianity is actually quite limited. One calendar entry, some numismatic evidence, scattered references. If the festival wasn't universally important, why would Christians feel compelled to compete with it? This challenges the appropriation narrative while opening questions about how we've reconstructed pagan religious practice from incomplete sources. Conversely, defenders of the appropriation theory note that absence of extensive Sol Invictus documentation might simply reflect poor survival of pagan sources after Christianity triumphed. Christians had both motive and opportunity to destroy or neglect pagan records, creating documentary bias favouring Christian sources. You're confronting the reality that historical records aren't neutral. They reflect what literate elites thought worth preserving. And after Constantine, those elites were increasingly Christian with little interest in carefully documenting the pagan practices they were supplanting. The question of whether Christmas is really rooted in pagan festivals also involves defining what rooted means. If it means the December 25th date was chosen to compete with paganism, the evidence remains genuinely ambiguous and contested. If it means Christmas absorbed pagan customs and practices, the evidence is overwhelming and largely uncontroversial. Evergreens, Yule logs, certain foods, aspects of Santa Claus, and more clearly have pre-Christian origins. You're learning to distinguish between questions about dating decisions versus questions about cultural practices. Recognizing these requires separate analysis. Modern scholars increasingly emphasize that the either-or framing might be misleading. Historical processes are rarely monocausal, multiple factors influence outcomes simultaneously. December 25th might have been calculated theologically, recognized as conveniently aligned with existing festivals, embraced partly for conversion utility, all while absorbing customs from those festivals because they were culturally available and appealing. You're watching historians move toward complexity and multiple causation rather than simple single-factor explanations. The debate also has contemporary stakes beyond academic interest. Christians who want to defend Christmas as authentically Christian rather than pagan appropriation have interest in emphasizing independent calculation theories. Secularists or critics who want to diminish Christianity's uniqueness have interest in stressing pagan borrowing. Neo-pagans seeking to reclaim pre-Christian heritage emphasize continuities that validate their own practices. You're recognizing that nobody approaches this debate from a purely neutral position. everyone brings assumptions, commitments, and desired conclusions that shape how they weigh ambiguous evidence. The scholarly debate models intellectual humility because it demonstrates that smart, well-informed people examining the same historical record can reach different defensible conclusions. You're learning that historical questions don't always have definitive answers, that evidence can support multiple interpretations, and that acknowledging uncertainty is more honest than false certainty. The historians arguing about Christmas origins are performing scholarship correctly following evidence, considering alternatives, revising positions when new information emerges, and maintaining respectful disagreement where consensus remains elusive. What's undeniable, regardless of which dating theory you favour, is that Christmas exists in its current form because of complex interactions between Christian theology, pagan practices, political decisions, commercial interests, literary creativity, and evolving cultural values across 2 millennia. The holiday is hybrid, synthetic, and constantly evolving. Whether its origins are pagan depends partly on how you define paganism, which elements you emphasize, and what you count as origins versus later accretions. You're discovering that the questions, "Is Christmas really rooted in pagan festivals?" might be less important than recognizing that Christmas represents humanity's layered, complicated, ongoing negotiation between sacred and secular, ancient and modern, universal and particular. As you close the academic journals and rub your tired eyes, you understand that this scholarly debate will likely continue because the evidence genuinely permits multiple interpretations. Neither side has a smoking gun. No ancient text says we Christians chose December 25th specifically to compete with Saul Invictus. Nor does any text provide irrefutable proof that the calculation was entirely independent. You're left with probabilities, plausibilities, and the recognition that historical truth sometimes remains frustratingly elusive despite our best investigative efforts. The uncertainty itself becomes meaningful, reminding us that the past doesn't surrender its secrets easily, and that humility about what we can know serves us better than overconfident claims to definitive answers. You're examining a massive evidence board like a detective trying to solve a complex case, and you're ready to weigh all the arguments about cultural borrowing versus coincidental convergence. The question before you is deceptively simple but profoundly complicated. Did Christianity deliberately steal Christmas from paganism? Or did similar winter celebrations emerge independently from different traditions that happen to occupy the same calendar space? You're about to discover that the answer involves distinguishing between different types of influence, different elements of the holiday, and different historical periods when various Christmas components crystallized. Start with the strongest evidence for independent Christian origins of the December 25th date. The integral age calculation appears in Christian sources by the early 3rd century. Possibly earlier Tertullian references March 25th as Christ's death and conception date around 200 CE. And the 9-month calculation to December 25th follows logically. This predates Emperor Aurelian's establishment of Sol Invictus on December 25th in 274 CE by several decades. If Christians were already discussing December 25th before pagans officially claimed that date for their sun god, the borrowing narrative requires revision. You're looking at what historians call precedents who got there first, matters for determining influence direction. The Eastern Church's parallel but separate calculation strengthens the independence argument. Eastern Christians, using identical methodology but different crucifixion assumptions, arrived at January 6th rather than December 25th. The existence of 2 dates calculated via the same theological reasoning suggests the method was genuinely Christian rather than post hoc rationalization for dates chosen to compete with paganism. If Christians were just looking for excuses to celebrate on pagan festival days, why would Eastern and Western churches calculate different dates? The divergence implies authentic internal theological reasoning rather than reactive anti-pagan strategy. But here's where the argument gets complicated. Even if Christians independently calculated December 25th, they surely noticed it coincided with existing pagan festivals. You're examining whether awareness of this coincidence influenced Christian decisions to emphasize this date over alternatives. Multiple possible birth dates circulated in early Christianity: December 25th, January 6th, March 25th, April 6th, and others. The fact that December 25th ultimately dominated in the West might have less to do with superior calculation and more to do with convenient alignment with existing December festivities that make conversion easier. Independence of origin doesn't preclude strategic exploitation of convenient timing. Now examine the customs rather than the date here. The evidence for pagan influence becomes overwhelming and largely uncontroversial. Evergreen decorations in winter predate Christianity by centuries across multiple cultures. Romans used holly and laurel during Saturnalia. Germanic peoples revered evergreens during Yule. Celts considered mistletoe sacred. These practices weren't invented by Christians, but absorbed as Christianity spread into regions where these customs were already established. You're watching clear cultural borrowing where Christians adapted existing practices by providing new theological meanings. Evergreens represent Christ's eternal life rather than pagan vitality magic. But the physical practice remains identical. The gift-giving tradition presents a mixed case. Christians could point to the Magi bringing gifts to infant Jesus as biblical precedent for Christmas gift exchange. But gift-giving during winter festivals predates Christianity. Romans exchanged gifts during Saturnalia and Kalends, these practices being well established before Christ's birth. Did Christians borrow from Roman custom and retroactively justify it through the Magi story? Or did they independently develop gift-giving based on the gospel narrative that happened to match existing practice? You're encountering the frustrating reality that when two traditions develop similar customs, determining influence direction from cultural contact versus independent invention becomes nearly impossible. The feast tradition is the clearest case of practical continuity, regardless of religious belief. Winter slaughter of livestock and consumption of stored goods happens for agricultural reasons independent of any religious framework. Pagans feasted in December because that's when food abundance existed before winter scarcity. Christians inherited the same agricultural calendar and economic pressures. You can't really claim Christians borrowed feasting from pagans when both were responding to identical material circumstances. This represents convergence driven by environmental factors rather than cultural transmission. The Yule log custom shows clear pagan origin that Christianity later Christianized. The practice of burning a special log during winter solstice appears in pre-Christian Germanic and Norse traditions, with explicit pagan religious meaning. Christians didn't invent this practice. They encountered it when evangelizing Northern Europe and chose to reinterpret rather than eliminate it. The log could symbolize Christ as light of the world rather than honoring pagan gods. But the physical practice and its timing remained distinctly pagan in origin. You're seeing accommodation and transformation rather than independent invention. Santa Claus represents layered synthesis, almost impossible to attribute to single sources. St. Nicholas is genuinely Christian. Odin's winter riding is genuinely pagan. Dutch Sinterklaas traditions blend both. American commercialization adds layers having nothing to do with either Christianity or paganism. Trying to call Santa pagan or Christian fails because he's fundamentally hybrid, incorporating elements from multiple traditions over many centuries, You're learning that some Christmas components are so thoroughly mixed that seeking pure origins becomes meaningless. The synthesis itself becomes the tradition. The Christmas tree debate illustrates how recent innovations can be falsely attributed to ancient paganism. The specific practice of cutting a fir tree, bringing it indoors, and decorating it emerges clearly in late medieval Germany, not in ancient pagan practice. Yet because the custom involves evergreens and occurs in winter, many people assume it continues ancient pagan tree worship. This assumption isn't entirely wrong. Reverence for evergreens is genuinely ancient and pre-Christian, but the specific Christmas tree custom is relatively modern, building on older reverence but not directly continuing an unbroken pagan tradition. You're distinguishing between conceptual continuity and practical continuity. The question of intentionality matters enormously. Did Christian leaders consciously, deliberately choose to appropriate pagan festivals as conversion strategy? Some evidence suggests yes. Pope Gregory XI explicitly advised missionaries to Britain to Christianize pagan sites and festivals rather than destroy them, recognizing that accommodation achieved conversion more effectively than confrontation. This 7th century policy demonstrates conscious appropriation strategy, though whether it applied to December 25th specifically remains unclear. You're finding proof that appropriation was sometimes deliberate policy, even if we can't prove it happened for every Christmas element. But much cultural borrowing happens unconsciously through everyday contact between communities. When Germanic peoples converted to Christianity, they didn't suddenly forget all their Yule customs. They naturally continued practices that felt normal while gradually adopting Christian theological frameworks. Over generations, customs originally performed for pagan gods got transferred to Christian purposes without anyone necessarily making explicit decisions to appropriate or preserve them. You're recognizing that cultural evolution often proceeds through gradual, unconscious processes rather than deliberate planning. The concept of inculturation from modern missiology helps explain historical processes. Christianity has always adapted to local cultures rather than imposing uniform practices globally. African Christianity looks different from Asian Christianity, which differs from European Christianity, because each enculturates into local contexts. Medieval Christianity spreading through pagan Europe naturally absorbed elements of Germanic and Celtic culture, including winter festival customs. This wasn't necessarily cynical appropriation, but rather the inevitable process of religious ideas taking root in specific cultural soil. You're seeing appropriation and authentic cultural expression simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggests that Christmas's relationship to paganism varies by element and by period. The December 25th date might have independent Christian origins, but was certainly aware of and possibly influenced by pagan festival timing. The evergreen decorations, feasting, some gift-giving customs clearly have pagan origins that Christianity absorbed and reinterpreted. The Christmas tree is medieval, not ancient pagan. Santa Claus blends Christian saints with pagan gods and modern commerce. The Victorian elements are 19th century innovations, claiming ancient precedent. You're learning that Christmas isn't uniformly pagan or uniformly Christian, it's a complex assemblage where different components have different origins. The genetic fallacy warns against dismissing something based solely on its origins. Even if Christmas absorbed pagan elements, that doesn't make current Christian celebration of Christmas illegitimate or inauthentic. Religious practices evolve, borrowing and transforming as they encounter new contexts. Christianity has always been a syncretic tradition, absorbing and Christianizing elements from Judaism, Greco-Roman philosophy, and local cultures it encounters. This isn't weakness or corruption, it's how living religions actually function in history. You're recognizing that purity of origin matters less than contemporary meaning and practice. Similarly, demonstrating Christian origins doesn't make Christmas celebrations by secular or non-Christian people inappropriate. If December festivals served human needs for millennia before Christianity, and if Christmas absorbed many pre-Christian elements, then people celebrating Christmas without Christian belief aren't corrupting the holiday, but rather connecting to its deeper pre-Christian roots. The holiday belongs to human culture broadly, not exclusively to Christianity or paganism. You're seeing how Christmas's hybrid nature actually makes it more accessible and adaptable across different belief systems. The question, is Christmas really rooted in pagan festivals, deserves the answer, it's complicated, and it depends what you mean. If you're asking whether Christians deliberately scheduled Christmas to override pagan festivals, the evidence is genuinely ambiguous and contested by serious scholars. If you're asking whether Christmas absorbed pagan customs and practices, the answer is clearly yes for many elements. If you're asking whether celebrating Christmas today means participating in paganism, the answer depends entirely on your intentions, and theological framework actions derive meaning from context, not just historical origins. What emerges clearly is that Christmas represents 2,000 years of cultural negotiation between religious traditions, seasonal celebrations, commercial interests, literary creativity, and evolving values. It's not purely anything, not purely Christian, not purely pagan, not purely secular, not purely commercial. It's a living tradition that continues evolving, adding layers while shedding others, meaning different things to different communities and individuals. You're discovering that Christmas's richness and adaptability come precisely from its hybrid origins and its willingness to absorb and transform elements from multiple sources. The debate itself matters because it reveals how we think about religious authenticity, cultural borrowing, and historical legitimacy. People who insist Christmas is entirely Christian often want to defend their religious practice from charges of paganism. People who insist Christmas is entirely pagan often want to critique Christianity or reclaim pre-Christian heritage. Both positions oversimplify a genuinely complex historical reality where influence flowed multiple directions across centuries. You're learning that intellectual honesty requires embracing ambiguity and resisting simplistic either-or framings when historical truth is legitimately complicated. As you step back from your evidence board covered with strings connecting various historical influences, you recognize that perhaps the most accurate answer to, is Christmas rooted in pagan festivals, is this: Christmas grew from multiple roots, some Christian, some pagan, some practical, some commercial, that intertwined over centuries into a tradition that transcends any single origin. The tree has pagan roots, Christian roots, medieval roots, Victorian roots, and commercial roots all feeding the same celebration. Trying to identify a single true root falsifies how cultural traditions actually develop through complex historical processes involving borrowing, innovation, adaptation, and synthesis across generations and civilizations. You're standing in your own home during a modern December, surveying the familiar tableau of Christmas as you actually celebrate it. The tree with its lights and ornaments, the wrapped presents beneath, the stockings hung by the fireplace or television, the playlist alternating between sacred carols and secular songs, the dinner menu being finalized, the cards sent to distant relatives. You're ready now to understand how all the historical threads you've traced pagan, Christian, medieval, Victorian, commercial weave together into the specific December traditions you perform each year, often without thinking about their origins or meanings. Your Christmas tree stands as the most visible symbol, and you now recognize its complex ancestry. The evergreen itself connects to ancient reverence for plants that defy winter's death, practiced by Romans, Norse, Celts, and countless others who brought greenery indoors as life-affirming magic. The specific practice of the decorated indoor tree emerges in medieval Germany, possibly from paradise tree traditions in religious drama, possibly from guild celebrations, definitely not from unbroken ancient pagan tree worship despite persistent myths claiming otherwise. The Victorian era standardized and globalized the practice. While modern commerce provides the industry that supplies millions of trees annually farmed, harvested, transported, and sold in seasonal markets, you plug in the lights, and you're participating in a surprisingly recent innovation. Electric Christmas lights were invented in 1882 by Edward Johnson, an associate of Thomas Edison, but remained expensive luxuries until mass production made them affordable by mid-20th century. Before electricity, families used candles clipped to branches beautiful, magical, and terrifyingly dangerous, causing countless house fires. The lights represent the ancient association between winter festivals and light conquering darkness. But the specific technology is thoroughly modern. You're watching how ancient symbolism adapts to new materials and capabilities without losing fundamental meaning. The ornaments hanging from your tree carry their own historical freight. Glass balls originated in 19th century Germany, initially hand-blown and expensive, later mass-produced and accessible. Some of your ornaments might be commercial products bought at big box stores, others handmade by children or received as gifts carrying personal memories. Each ornament tells a small story the year you visited a particular place, the child's first Christmas, the ornament that survived decades and moves with you through different homes. You're creating personal meaning within a commercial and traditional framework, making the holiday simultaneously standardized and intimately individual. The presents beneath your tree participate in gift-giving traditions stretching back to Roman Saturnalia, Christian Magi stories, St. Nicholas legends, and modern advertising campaigns that establish Christmas as the year's primary consumer event. You've spent weeks or months selecting, purchasing, wrapping these gifts, engaging in an economic ritual that drives substantial portions of retail economy annually. The gifts represent love, obligation, tradition, social expectation, and genuine desire to please people you care about, motivations so tangled that separating them becomes impossible. You're experiencing how ancient religious and pagan customs have been thoroughly commercialized while retaining emotional and social significance. The stockings hung with care reference St. Nicholas legends about gold thrown through windows landing in drying stockings. But the specific practice of hanging stockings for Santa to fill is relatively modern, standardized largely through 19th century literature and illustration. You might use actual socks, decorative fabric stockings, or elaborate personalized creations the container matters less than the ritual of filling and discovering. Children experience magic. Adults experience the pleasure of creating that magic while remembering when they believed it themselves. You're perpetuating a tradition that's partly religious origin story, partly Victorian invention, and wholly meaningful regardless of historical pedigree. Your dinner menu likely includes foods with deep historical roots, ham or turkey as centerpiece, carrying forward centuries of winter feasting on specially prepared meats, side dishes varying by regional and family tradition, desserts possibly including pie, cookies or pudding that reference medieval and Victorian foodways. You're eating foods chosen partly for taste, partly for tradition, partly because stores market them as appropriate Christmas fare. The meal connects you to agricultural rhythms that once made December the season of abundance before scarcity, even though modern refrigeration and global supply chains mean you could eat the same foods any time. The feast persists not from necessity, but from meaningful tradition. The music playing might include religious carols like Silent Night or O Come All Ye Faithful, alongside secular songs like Jingle Bells or Winter Wonderland. You're experiencing the dual nature of Christmas as simultaneously religious holy day and cultural festival. Some songs worship Christ's birth while others simply celebrate winter, gift-giving, and Santa Claus without religious content. This musical diversity reflects Christmas's hybrid nature, accommodating both devout religious observers and secular participants within the same seasonal celebration. The songs you prefer might correlate with your religious commitments, or you might simply enjoy whichever songs evoke pleasant nostalgia or festive mood. If you attend religious services, you're participating in distinctly Christian observance nativity readings, hymns focused on incarnation theology, perhaps communion or special rituals. The service emphasizes elements largely absent from secular celebration Christ's divinity, salvation theology, worship and prayer. This is where Christmas remains most clearly Christian, least influenced by pagan or commercial elements. Though even here you might notice evergreen decorations or cultural customs that aren't strictly biblical. The church service and the home celebration exist in tension-related but different, sacred and secular aspects of the same holiday that don't always cohere comfortably. Your social obligations during December parties with co-workers, gatherings with extended family, exchanges with neighbours reflect Christmas's community-building function that transcends specific religious content. You're strengthening social bonds through shared ritual, demonstrating belonging to communities defined by workplace, family, or geography. These gatherings often involve gift exchanges, special foods, and considerable alcohol echoing Roman Saturnalia and medieval Christmas revelry more than anything in the Gospels. You're experiencing how holidays facilitate social cohesion, allowing people to navigate complex social networks through standardized rituals that everyone understands. If you have children, you might perpetuate the Santa Claus mythology, presenting gifts as coming from a magical figure rather than from parents, staging evidence of his nocturnal visit, maintaining elaborate fictions about North Pole workshops and naughty or nice lists. You're creating childhood magic while knowing it's based on stories blending Christian saints, pagan gods, and commercial invention. The practice generates controversy. Some argue it's harmless fun that enriches childhood. Others contend it's lying to children and displacing Christ from Christmas. Your choice reflects your values about childhood, truth, religion, and what Christmas should emphasize. The Christmas cards you've sent or received participate in a Victorian tradition that persists despite email and social media offering easier communication methods. The cards serve as yearly updates, demonstrations of social connection, and physical objects that decorate homes and announce to visitors that you're embedded in networks of people who care enough to send cards. Some cards emphasize religious imagery, nativity scenes, angels, crosses, while others feature Santa, snowmen, or generic winter scenes. The variety reflects Christmas's ability to accommodate different emphases within a shared seasonal framework. Your decorations beyond the tree might include lights on your house exterior, wreaths on doors, figurines displayed on shelves, perhaps an elaborate nativity scene or a whimsical Santa collection. Each decoration represents a choice about how to signal Christmas religious, secular, traditional, playful, elegant, or kitschy. Your aesthetic choices communicate your Christmas identity to neighbours and visitors, announcing how you position yourself within the holiday's many possible meanings. You're performing Christmas through material culture, using objects to express values and create atmosphere. The stress and exhaustion you might feel alongside the joy reflects Christmas's demanding nature, the gift shopping and wrapping, the meal preparation, the social obligations, the travel, the financial strain, the family dynamics that can turn fraught during enforced togetherness. Christmas requires enormous labour, mostly from women who plan, shop, cook, clean, and orchestrate the magic that appears effortless but isn't. You're experiencing how the holiday's expansion into a multi-week season of consumption and celebration creates burdens alongside pleasures, and how traditional gender roles often determine who bears most organisational and emotional labour. The charitable giving and volunteering that spike during December connect to Dickens' vision of Christmas as a season of generosity toward those less fortunate. You might donate to food banks, volunteer at shelters, participate in toy drives, or simply feel more sympathetic toward people experiencing poverty and hardship. This impulse toward charity is arguably Christmas's best quality, the reminder that abundance should be shared, that community includes obligations to strangers, that celebration should extend beyond private enjoyment, whether motivated by Christian teaching, secular humanism, or simple seasonal sentiment. The charitable impulse makes December meaningful beyond consumer indulgence. The mix of sacred and secular in your celebration probably doesn't feel contradictory to you. It's simply how Christmas is, how you've always experienced it, a seamless blend that only becomes strange when you analyse its components separately. You're not consciously thinking, now I'm doing the pagan part, now the Christian part, now the Victorian part, now the commercial part. It's all just Christmas, a unified experience drawing from multiple historical streams without requiring you to acknowledge or even know those origins. This unreflective synthesis is exactly how living traditions function. They incorporate diverse elements into coherent wholes that participants experience as natural and obvious. The aspects you emphasize versus downplay reveal your values. A strongly religious family might minimize Santa and commercial elements while emphasizing nativity scenes, church services, and theological discussion. A secular family might skip religious services entirely while enthusiastically celebrating Santa, gifts, and festive aesthetics. An anti-consumerist family might emphasize homemade gifts, simple meals, and charitable giving while resisting commercial pressure. The flexibility to customize Christmas according to diverse values explains its persistence. The holiday accommodates genuine religious devotion and secular enjoyment, lavish spending and frugal creativity, traditional conformity and innovative expression, the nostalgia you feel during Christmas, longing for childhood celebrations, remembering loved ones no longer present, yearning for simpler times represents a universal human experience that holidays crystallize. Christmas becomes a container for memory, a yearly reminder of how time passes and things change. The tree you decorated as a child no longer exists. The people gathered then have scattered or died. The innocence and wonder you felt has been replaced by adult knowledge and responsibility. Yet the ritual's repetition creates continuity, allowing you to participate in the same essential celebration across decades, despite everything changing. You're experiencing tradition's power to create meaningful connection across time. The environmental concerns about Christmas cut trees that die after weeks, excessive packaging waste, carbon footprint of shipping gifts globally, energy consumption of lighting displays reflect modern awareness that traditions developed in different contexts might need adaptation for contemporary challenges. Some families switch to artificial trees, minimize packaging, shop locally, or reduce consumption in response to environmental ethics. Others maintain traditional practices unchanged. The tension between preserving meaningful tradition and adapting to new realities shows that Christmas continues evolving, that living traditions must respond to changing circumstances or risk becoming irrelevant. The question of whether your Christmas is pagan probably never occurs to you outside of hearing debates about the topic. You're simply celebrating Christmas as your culture presents it, participating in a tradition that feels natural and right regardless of historical origins. The pagan elements, if you even recognize them as such, don't make the celebration less meaningful or authentic. The Christian elements don't require you to be Christian to appreciate or participate. The commercial elements don't automatically corrupt the experience, even if they sometimes annoy you. The Victorian sentimentality, the medieval echoes, the ancient winter festival DNA, all of these layers coexist without contradiction because your Christmas is synthetic, hybrid, and historically complex in ways that enrich rather than diminish it. As you settle into your favourite chair, surveying the scene you've created, the glowing tree, the wrapped presents, the decorated home, the planned meal, the gathered or soon-to-gather loved ones, you're participating in a tradition that's simultaneously ancient and modern, sacred and secular, pagan and Christian and commercial. Your Christmas doesn't need to be historically pure to be meaningful. It doesn't require single origins to be authentic. The question, is Christmas rooted in pagan festivals, becomes less important than recognizing that Christmas as you celebrate it draws from multiple roots, grows through countless branches, and produces fruits that nourish contemporary human needs for beauty, connection, meaning, and celebration during the darkest time of the year. You're creating your own Christmas within inherited frameworks, accepting some traditions while modifying or rejecting others, passing on to children or younger people your version of this endlessly adaptable holiday. In doing so, you're continuing the process that's defined Christmas throughout history: absorption, adaptation, innovation, and transmission across generations. The pagan and Christian and Victorian and commercial threads don't unravel into separate elements. They're woven together so thoroughly that the fabric would disintegrate if you tried pulling them apart. Your Christmas, the one you actually live rather than historically analyze, is the tradition impure, complicated, meaningful, and yours. The lights twinkle in the darkness outside your window, defying winter's early night. The warmth inside contrasts with cold outside. The gathering draws you toward others while the season's darkness might otherwise encourage isolation. Whether you understand these experiences as honouring Christ's birth, celebrating Sol Invictus, marking the solstice, or simply enjoying yearly tradition matters less than the fundamental human impulse to create light, warmth, community, and hope precisely when the world feels darkest and coldest. That impulse is older than any religion, deeper than any doctrine, and more enduring than any empire. It's why winter festivals existed before Christmas, why Christmas absorbed those festivals, and why people will continue celebrating something in December, long after current Christmas forms have evolved into whatever comes next. You're participating in human culture's long conversation with winter, death, darkness, and scarcity, a conversation that always ends with the stubborn insistence that light returns, life persists, and community endures despite everything. The December night deepens around you, and the day's activities fade into the gentle rhythm of evening settling. The questions about pagan roots and Christian authenticity that seemed so urgent earlier now feel distant, less important than the simple peace of this moment. Your breath slows. The lights on the tree blur softly as your eyelids grow heavy. each point of light becoming a small, friendly star in your personal winter constellation. You're releasing the need to categorize and analyze, letting Christmas simply be what it is, a gift of light in darkness, warmth in cold, connection in isolation. The ancient Romans who feasted during Saturnalia, the Norse peoples who burned Yule logs, the early Christians who calculated December dates, the Victorian families who gathered around trees. And you tonight in your own home, all of you are doing the same essential thing. You are refusing to let winter have the final word. You are insisting that humanity deserves celebration, that darkness doesn't win, that this cold season will pass and light will return. The historical debates dissolve like snow melting. What remains is simpler, deeper the glow of lights, the comfort of familiar ritual, the presence of people you love or the memory of those no longer here. Christmas, in all its complicated hybrid glory, offers you this annual gift: permission to rest, to celebrate, to hope, to remember that spring exists somewhere beyond winter's grip. Your eyes close. The room's warmth embraces you. The year's longest night has passed or will pass soon, and daylight begins its slow return. You're part of that return, part of the light, part of the enduring human family that has celebrated midwinter for millennia and will continue celebrating for millennia more. Sleep now. The questions can wait. The light will still be there tomorrow and the day after, growing stronger with each sunrise, just as it always has, just as it always will. Sweet dreams.